I closed my eyes for 1 second. I opened them 10,000 years later. Nobody had warned me, because by then, there was nobody left who could. The lid of my pod cracked open with a sound like a bone breaking. Rusty water poured over my legs. I fell out onto wet stone in a hospital gown and breathed air that tasted green. The cave I woke up in was not really a cave anymore. It had a ceiling of roots and a floor of moss, and somewhere above me a bird was screaming at another bird about something urgent. I crawled toward the light. Where my city should have been, there was jungle. Not a park. Not a ruin with vines on it. Jungle to the horizon, with mist sitting low in it like soup. The earth had grown over us. Humanity was gone, and the top of the food chain now stood 3 meters tall, which I was about to learn in person. I did not even get to finish that thought. The bushes exploded, and a girl fell out of them and landed at my feet. She was, and I know exactly how this sounds, stunningly beautiful. Torn rags, dirt on one cheek, and 2 fluffy ears on top of her head that were pressed flat with fear. Behind her came the monster. 3 meters of gray muscle, tusks like garden tools, a club that used to be a tree. An orc, an actual orc, mutated and enormous and extremely interested in us. The girl could barely stand. Her legs were shaking so hard that I could see it from where I sat. She got up anyway. She put herself between me and that thing and raised a broken bone spear. "Run, strange hairless man," she shouted. "I will hold him," and I want to be very clear about my situation at that moment. I was barefoot, in a hospital gown, holding absolutely nothing. A woman I had known for 4 seconds was about to die in front of me, and I was already quietly applying for the position of lunch. Then, a mechanical voice went off inside my skull, calm and bright, like a microwave, announcing that it was finished. Ding! Database of all human technology unlocked. The interface bloomed in front of my eyes. Blue light, clean lines, a search bar. 10,000 years of dust on the entire world, and my personal menu still had a search bar. Oh yes! I remember exactly what I thought in that moment. I thought, I am the god of this new world. Then I shouted at it inside my head. System, create a plasma cannon. Error, not enough uranium. Fine, I thought. Forget the artillery, just give me a machine gun. Error. Not enough iron. The orc was lifting the club. Give me anything. There was a flash of light in my palm. It was warm. It was beautiful. It was one single rusty iron screw. The orc stared at the screw. I stared at the screw. The girl stared at me, and her ears came up, which I would learn much later is what her face does when hope is leaving the building. My divine system needed real materials. Actual atoms. I was standing in a world made of dirt and sticks, holding 4 grams of my entire civilization, so I looked up at the 3-meter monster, smiled at it in a friendly and deeply unconvincing way, and screamed, "Plan B." I grabbed her hand and we ran into the jungle at a speed that would have broken several Olympic records if there had been anybody left to keep them. We went through the brush like 2 rabbits with a deadline. Behind us, the orc was not going around the trees. He was going through them. I thought we had lost him. That was optimistic. What I had actually lost was my footing, because my city grace found a root the size of my own leg. The world turned over. Sky, dirt, one very rude branch. We rolled down the slope together and came to a stop at the bottom in a tangle. When everything held still again, I understood that I was lying directly on top of her. My hands were planted in the moss on both sides of her head. Our faces were close enough that I could feel her breath on my mouth. Her eyes went enormous. Her whole face went red, not pink, red, like a warning light. Those fluffy ears twitched twice and then folded flat, and I have never in my life been so aware of where my own hands were. I wanted to say something cool, something like, "Sorry, that was an accident." I did not get the chance. A shadow came over us and swallowed the sun. The orc had caught up, and he was in no hurry now, because we had arranged ourselves so conveniently for him. He raised the club for the kill, and I panicked in that specific way, where your hands keep working while your brain is still screaming. I threw the interface open and dragged through it. Everything wanted metal. Everything wanted refined chemicals. Everything wanted a world that did not exist anymore. Then one line stopped me. One single recipe that asked for nothing but quartz and dirt. I was lying in dirt. I was lying on a bed of white gravel. I pressed create. A cylinder appeared in my fist, cold and heavy, and I threw it straight into that enormous face. Boom. The flash went through the jungle like a white wall. The crack arrived a heartbeat later and hit me in the chest from the inside. Birds came up off the canopy in every direction at once. The orc went backward into the bushes and stopped moving. My homemade flashbang had done exactly what it was designed to do, which is to be unbelievably rude. She was looking at me and shaking, and it was not fear anymore. It was the other thing. The thing people used to look at rockets with. And me. I was looking at my own hands. All right, so I was not an all-powerful god yet. I needed to gather materials, dig ore, and find out what this world was even made of. But inside my head were the blueprints for everything. Matches, glass, antibiotics, steel, engines, nuclear reactors, all of it, waiting for a world with something in it. So grab your snacks and get comfortable. Let us see how one loser with a broken system and one very flustered fox girl turned this Stone Age into a modern empire. Shaking started about 10 seconds after the orc went down. I assumed it was adrenaline. That is the normal assumption, and it was wrong. My teeth were knocking together hard enough to hurt. My fingers had gone the color of old paper. The jungle was warm, and I was standing in it, freezing. There was a line under the recipe in my interface that I had not read because I had been busy not dying. Thermal draw, it said. Moderate. I want to state for the record that I am a laboratory technician. Reading the fine print before pressing the button was, in theory, my entire profession. The girl got her arm under mine and hauled. She was half my weight and she moved me anyway. Up, she said. Up, up. The noise goes far. Others come. Others. That word did a great deal of work in a very small space. I got my legs under me and we went. I looked back once for the screw. It was not in my hand anymore. Somewhere on that slope, in half a meter of wet leaves, 4 grams of iron were lying in the dark. I told myself it did not matter. It was a screw. In a world with no metal in it, I let myself lose the only piece of metal I owned, because I was cold and it was small. We walked until the light went orange and then went out entirely. Near the equator, the sun does not set so much as get switched off by somebody leaving a room. My feet were bare. I had been barefoot for 2 hours over roots and stone and things that bit. I stopped noticing individual injuries and started noticing an overall theme. The temperature dropped. Not much. Maybe 8 degrees. In a hospital gown, wet to the knee, with no fat on me and no fire, 8 degrees is a diagnosis. She found a hollow under the roots of a fallen giant and packed dead leaves against my back like she was insulating a wall. Then she looked at my face and stopped smiling. And that was when I understood, very clearly, with the entire technological legacy of the human species sitting in my head, that I was going to die of cold before morning. So I did what any reasonable man would do. I opened the interface and asked my godlike system for a blanket. I was holding a double handful of dead leaves, cellulose, fiber, the exact material a blanket is made of. This was, I thought, the easiest request in the history of requests. Error. Volume exceeds capacity. Then, helpfully, it offered me the largest version it could actually produce, and I said yes because I was not thinking clearly. There was a flash. In my hands was a square of clean white cloth roughly the size of a napkin. It was very soft. It was, in every sense, a napkin. It also cost me more heat. I had traded warmth for a napkin at a loss during a cold emergency. My teeth were now knocking so hard the girl put her hand on my jaw to stop it. So I tried the obvious thing. Give her the system. She had hands, she had body heat, she knew this world. Let her hold the library, and I would just tell her what to build. The interface came up with exactly one option. Transfer. Whole. Once. Nothing remains. I have never closed a menu faster in my life. She watched me twitch at nothing, and then she gave up on me and went to work. She scraped a hollow in the wood. She cut a notch, she set a spindle in it and started a bow. Now I could have given a lecture on that. Friction, ignition temperature, the tinder bundle, the coal transfer. I have read the papers. I have seen the diagrams. Earlier that day, I had also tried it for 11 minutes on the slope while she was watching. What I produced was warm wood and a blister. She did it in the time it takes to describe it. Smoke, coal, tinder, breath, flame. She did not look proud about it. She looked worried, which was worse. The heat came into me sideways, the way it does when you have been cold too long. I sat there and shook and let a stranger keep me alive with a stick and a shoelace of gut. She put something in my hand, a fat white grub, roasted, and a root that had gone soft in the ashes. I ate both. I would like to report that they were terrible. They were excellent. The grub tasted like scallop and butter. I ate 4 more, and she watched me with the specific expression of a person recalculating how much food she needs. When I was warm again, the interface came back on its own. It had been closed, not by me. That was the second rule I learned that day, and it taught me the hard way. No heat, no library. My great inheritance ran on soup. She started talking then, low and fast, and I caught maybe 1 word in 3. It was frustrating in a way I could not place, because it was not the frustration of a foreign language. It was the frustration of a radio that is almost tuned. Then she pointed at the sky and said a word for night, and pointed at the stream and said a word for water. Both of them were mine. Bent, worn smooth, chewed by 10,000 years of mouths, but mine. She was speaking English. Nobody had told her it had a name. I sat with that for a long moment. Somebody had kept talking. Through whatever ended us, through all of it, somebody had kept talking and never stopped, and here it was. I put my hand on my chest and said my name. Theo. She tried it twice, got it wrong in an adorable way, and then got it right and looked pleased with herself. Then she put her hand on her own chest. Ilka, she said, and her ears came forward, and I made a note that the ears were going to be a problem for my concentration. Morning came gray and wet. I was starving in a way I had never experienced, the kind that makes you stupid. So I made the mistake I had been building toward all night. I filled my hands with river mud and asked the system for food. It has carbon, it has minerals, it has water. Food is made of those. This is not complicated chemistry. There was a flash. In my hands was a smooth gray brick. It was warm. It smelled faintly of nothing. I bit it because I was not at my best, and it was exactly as good as it sounds. The system does not assemble the living. It never has. It never would. My library could build me a reactor, and it could not build me a strawberry. Ilka took the brick out of my hands, turned it over, sniffed it, and put it down carefully, the way you set aside something that belongs to a sick person. Then she went flat against the ground, and her ears turned like two dishes tracking a signal, and she pulled me down beside her without asking. Below us on the slope, the orc had gotten up. One side of his face was burned. One eye was white. He was not looking for us at all. He was quartering the ground, nose down, back and forth, working the leaf litter in strips the way a professional searches a room. He stopped at the place where I had fallen. He dug with both hands. He came up holding something so small I could not see it from where we lay, and I did not have to. He held it out at arm's length like a live coal, and he made a sound, not a roar, one long note, dropping at the end. It went a very long way through the trees. He turned north and ran, and he did not stop running, and he took my 4 grams of iron with him. Ilka hit me on the arm. Not hard. It was the smack you give a child who has walked into the road. You made a shiny thing, she said, in front of him. You made a shiny thing. I said it was a screw. I said it was the least important object in the universe. I said several other things that sounded, out loud, considerably worse than they had in my head. She was not listening. She was already digging into the wrap at her waist with both hands, and her ears were flat again, and she was breathing wrong. She took out a bundle of leaves and unfolded it in her lap. Inside was a spoon. A steel spoon. Ordinary, dull, scratched, absolutely unremarkable. The kind of thing that used to arrive by the 100 in a plastic tray. I had eaten with 1,000 of them. 10,000 years of jungle sat on top of everything my species had ever made, and here was a spoon, and I could not breathe properly. There were letters stamped small on the handle. They were worn, but they were readable. Property of Site 12. I ran my thumb across them twice. Where did you get this? I asked her. The dead ground, she said, and then she said the rest of it fast, before I could interrupt, the way you confess. Our water is going bad. 3 seasons now. The old ones say the dead ground has the things that fix water. So I went in. I took the shiny bone. I was going to bring it back before anyone knew. And now, she said, and stopped, and looked at the north where the orc had gone with my screw. Now the gray death comes, she said. Bury it. Bury it deep, and we run, and maybe it does not come to my people. I asked her what the gray death was, and I asked it the way an educated man asks about a local superstition, which is to say, badly. She told me, not much, and flatly, and none of it sounded like anything except the kind of story people tell about a bad year. And then, I said the thing that shaped everything that came after, and I want to be clear that it was the first decision I made in this world that was not panic. I said, take me there. She said no. She said the word twice, and then she gave me the rest of it, which was that people do not go and look at that. They go away from it, and that this is not cowardice, it is simply what the thing is. I said, I made a shiny thing yesterday, and I am going to make more. I have to. Everybody where you live is drinking water that is killing them, and I am fairly sure I know how to stop it. I said, so before I make one more object in this world, I am going to stand next to what it does and watch it do it. And if you will not take me, I will go and find it myself, and I will probably walk straight into the middle of it. That last part was true, and she knew it was true, and it is the only argument I have ever won with her by being useless. She stood up and picked up her broken spear and looked at me with an expression I did not have a name for yet. Then she started walking, and I went behind her, and she did not say another word for 2 hours. She set the terms before we started walking, and she set them the way a professional does, without apologizing for a single one of them. Hands empty. Nothing on me anywhere. She checked me twice, including inside my mouth, which I found insulting and also completely correct. Then she went in front and stayed there, and after 20 minutes, I understood that this was not politeness. She was reading the ground for both of us, and she did not trust me to walk on it alone. She stopped every few hundred paces and turned her head slowly with her eyes shut. Not listening. Smelling. Working a pattern. Left, center, right, the way you sweep a field. About an hour in, she stopped, put her arm across my chest without looking at me, and took us off the path in a wide loop through thorn that cost us 20 minutes and most of my shins. I asked why, because the ground ahead looked like ground. Grass, a fallen branch, a bird working at something in the leaves. She said there is dust under it. Old, small. Somebody lost a knife there a long time ago, or a buckle, or a spoon. I said it looks like grass. She said, it is grass. It comes back over the top in about a lifetime, and it comes back well, and underneath it there is nothing holding you up at all, and you are much heavier than I am. Then she said a thing I have thought about a great many times since, because 10 months later, it very nearly killed a child in front of me. She said, the old ones are not dangerous because they eat. They are dangerous because they are deep. I asked what she was doing. She gave me the word for it, and the closest I can put it in my own language is that she was the one who walks in front. Her people had a job for that. She was it. We came over a low ridge in the middle of the morning, and the jungle stopped. I do not mean it thinned out. I mean it stopped along a line, the way a lawn stops at a driveway. On my side, green to the ankle. On the other side, gray. Gray dust, ankle deep, spread over an area about the size of 4 football fields. Nothing burned. Nothing melted. The trees at the edge were alive and healthy, right up to the line and then simply absent. I have seen fire damage. I have seen chemical spills. This was neither. This was subtraction. There were shapes under the dust, long, low rectangles, a curve, one clean right angle. Somebody had built here, and the shape of what they built was still lying under the surface like a body under a sheet. Ilka pointed and named things for me, and every one of her names was a warning. That is where the ground opens. There, the dust is deeper than a man. Not walk on the smooth part, so I walked the edge instead, and about 100 paces along, I found something that stopped me. A pane of glass. Flat, filthy, chipped at one corner, lying on top of the gray like a plate left on a table. It was perfectly intact. I could see my own hand through it. 10 paces away, there was a low line of foundation stone, also intact, cut square by somebody who cared about square. Between the stone and the glass, there was nothing at all. I stood there and started doing the arithmetic, and once you start, you cannot stop. No ruins, not anywhere. I had come out of that cave and looked at a horizon of jungle and thought, well, 10,000 years, of course, everything falls down eventually. But things do not vanish. Concrete lasts, stone lasts. Glass lasts almost forever, and here was the proof of it lying in front of me, still clear enough to look through. Steel does not vanish either, rusts, and it stains the ground orange for 1,000 years, and it leaves a shadow of itself in the dirt. There was no shadow anywhere on this planet. There had been no ore near the surface either. I had not thought about it yet because I had been busy freezing, but I had walked past a dozen cuts and gullies, and every one of them was clean. Something had eaten it, not time. Time is patient and stupid and leaves a mess behind. Something had gone through this world and taken every refined metal in it, down to the last spoon. And I did something then that I had not done since the flashbang, which was open the interface on purpose, standing still, with nobody chasing me. I went down the list, not looking for anything, just looking. The way you check a pocket you already know is empty. Every line was red. Wire, red. Nail, red. Pot, red. Blade, red. Hinge, spring, needle, screw, red, 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 red. Morning before, on a slope, with 3 meters of orc standing over me, that had been the funniest and worst thing that had ever happened to a human being. Standing at the edge of that field, it stopped being a joke about my luck and became a description of the planet. The list was not broken. The list was accurate. There was no iron in it because there is no iron anywhere, and my library had been telling me so, item by item, in plain language, since the first minute I owned it. I had heard the whole inventory of the end of the world and taken it for a punchline. And it was obviously not finished, because Ilka was standing 4 paces behind me with a spoon in her hand and the expression of a person holding a lit fuse. She found a flat rock at the edge of the gray. Ilka has called that place the Spoonfield ever since, and so does everybody else now, and none of them know why. She set the spoon on it, out in the open, and then she walked backward away from it and made me walk backward too, upwind and uphill. Then we waited. She sat down to do it. She had done this before, and that was the detail that frightened me most, that a girl her age had a procedure for this. Nothing happened for a long time. Long enough that I began assembling an argument in my head about folk memory and how superstition attaches itself to real disasters. Then, the gray moved. It did not rush. It did not roar. Across a stretch of ground, maybe 40 paces wide, the surface went from flat to textured, like frost blooming across a window, only faster. It came in from every direction at once, converging on that rock, and it took its time. There was no sound at all. That was the part my body objected to. There was no sound. It climbed the rock. It went over the spoon the way water goes over a stone, and it sat there working, and the shape of the spoon stayed visible under the surface for a while, and then it did not. When the gray drew back, and it did draw back slowly, the way a tide goes out, there was no spoon. The rock was still there, but the top of it had been ground flat and dull. And in a circle around it, out to about 4 paces, the grass was gone and the soil had turned the color of ash. I sat down. I did not decide to sit down. Ilka gave me the rest of it in short, flat sentences while I put my head between my knees. Her people know these rules the way you know not to touch a hot stove. It does not chase you. It does not want you. Her grandmother once walked across the middle of a gray field carrying a child and came out the far side with nothing worse than dirty feet. It does not cross running water. She took me down to the stream at the western edge and showed me, and it was true and it was absolute. The gray came to the water and stopped along it like a drawn line. It does not take stone. It does not take bone. It does not take wood. It does not take the clear stone of the old ones, which is why that pane of glass was lying there and always would be. And if you put something shiny down and leave it one night and one day, it comes. Every time. That is the whole rule. I asked her about the spoon because she had been carrying it for 3 days and nothing at all had happened to her. She looked at me the way you look at somebody who has asked why water is wet. She said, "A thing in your hand is not lying anywhere. It only starts counting when you set it down and walk away, one night and one day." I sat by that stream a while and let the thing land on me properly. My library held somewhere around 400,000 entries. I had spent the previous night shivering under a pile of leaves dreaming about a lathe because a lathe is the machine that makes machines. Every single item worth having in that entire library, from a sewing needle to a steam engine to the rifle I had honestly intended to build by the end of the month, was made of refined metal. I was not carrying the seed of a new civilization. I was carrying a very long and extremely detailed list of ways to call that thing down on the heads of whoever was standing next to me, and the orc had my screw. He had been running north with it since dawn. Somewhere up there, a night and a day were going to pass, and then there would be a circle of gray, and it would be mine. Ilka watched my face through all of it and said nothing, which I appreciated more than I know how to explain. Then I started laughing, which alarmed her, and then I said the first genuinely useful sentence I had produced since I woke up. "Fine," I said. "No metal." She did not understand. So I said it again in smaller pieces, mostly for my own benefit because I was building the plan out loud in front of her. No metal, nothing shiny, not a nail, not a pot, not a blade. Everything I make from here has to be made out of what that thing refuses to eat. Stone, bone, wood, fired clay, lime, and above all glass, because glass is sand and ash and fire, and this world has more sand in it than anything else, and the gray will not touch it. You can go a long way on clay and glass. Further than people think. Clean water, storage, medicine, light, heat, chemistry, and writing. Not everything, but a great deal. I was talking to myself by then and drawing in the mud with a stick, and she crouched down across from me and watched the stick like the stick was the interesting one. Then I asked her about the water. She told me straight. 3 seasons ago, their spring changed. Not dry. Worse than dry. The water still came, and it still looked like water, and it made people sick. Old ones first. Then the small ones. Belly sickness that goes away and comes back and goes away and comes back and takes the weight off a child until the child stops standing up. Her brother was 9. His name was Pim. He had been the worst of them for 2 months. That was why she had walked into the dead ground alone with a bone spear. I asked to see the spring. I said I might be able to do something about it, and I was careful with the word might. She stood up fast and said no. Not no to the spring, no to me. She said it twice, and her ears went flat, and she would not look at me while she said it. Then she gave me the actual reason. Her people have one story older than all the others, older than the gray itself. That story, the world was broken by people with no fur on them, and those people are the reason for everything that came after. She said that if I walked into her village, they would tie me, and then they would decide, and the deciding would not take long. Then she said the part that got me. She said she would not be able to stop them because she was the one who had carried the shiny bone home in the first place. I thought about that for a minute. Then I asked her one question. How far is the spring from the houses? She said it was in the middle of them. She said it was the reason the houses were there at all. So I got up and started walking in the direction she had come from, barefoot, in a hospital gown, holding nothing whatsoever. She caught me at the bottom of the slope and called me an idiot in a language that nobody had spoken aloud in 10,000 years, and I understood every single word of it. The village sat in a bowl of high ground with a thorn fence around it and about 60 people inside, and I spotted the thing that mattered before I had taken 10 steps through the gate. There was no metal in it. None. Not a blade, not a pin, not a hook, not a decoration. That by itself proves nothing. Plenty of people have lived well without metal. What told me the truth was the second look, and the second look took my breath away. Their fish hooks were bone, their knives were stone, pots were fired clay, and good fired clay, better than I expected. Their needles were splinters of rib, polished down, and every shell on every necklace had been rubbed dull with sand. Every one. Somebody in this village had made a rule about shine, and the rule was old enough that nobody argued with it anymore. This was not a people who had never had metal. This was a people who had decided about metal generations ago and had held that decision every single day since. They saw me from about 40 paces out. I want to describe the sound, and the problem is that there was not one. 60 people at work went quiet in stages, like lamps going out in a street, and then the children were gone. Not running. Taken. A man came out to meet us with 4 others behind him. He was maybe 30, built like a swimmer, and he carried himself as somebody who was good at something and knew it. He looked at my face, then at my hands, then at my bare feet, and every look took information out and put nothing back. His name was Cobb, and he did not say a word to me for 2 hours. They tied me with cord at the wrists and elbows, and they did it carefully, and there was no cruelty in it anywhere, which I found much more frightening than shoving would have been. Ilka talked the whole way in. She talked fast, and she kept using a word I did not have yet, and she was still talking when they sat me down in the middle of the village and went to get the old woman. The old woman was a badger. I say that with respect. Gray-striped face, heavy shoulders, hands like 2 shovels, and about 70 years of not being impressed by anything. Her name was Denna, and she was the one who decided things. She stood in front of me a long time, and then she did not ask who I was or where I came from. She said, "Name the 3 villages." I said I did not understand, so she named them for me, and she named them the way you read out a debt. The first was called something I could not catch. 4 days walk to the east, and it had 11 families in it, and it had a good stream, and she had been a girl there. It is gray ground now. The second was a river camp 2 days north. 19 people. Her husband was born there. It is gray ground now. The third had been half a morning from where I was sitting, on the ridge we could see from the gate. It had 31 people in it. It went gray when she was 52, and 4 of the 31 got out. Then she told me the part that mattered, and she told it flat, without any drama, because the drama was already sitting in it. Before each one, she said, a hairless thing came. Not always a person. Once, it was a person. Twice, it was a thing the hunters found and brought home, because it was beautiful. Now here is the thing about that argument. It was not superstition. I want to be very clear because I sat there and checked it, and it took me about 4 seconds. She had the causality exactly right. A shiny object appears. 1 night and 1 day pass. The place ends. 3 times in 1 lifetime, 3 times confirmed, 0 exceptions. She had built a law out of clean observation with no theory underneath it at all, and the law worked, and the law had kept these 60 people alive. And I had come walking through her gate. Cobb said the obvious next sentence. He said it without heat. He said that the safe thing, the only thing, was to take me out past the ridge and be done before dark. And Ilka stepped in front of me, again, for the second time in 2 days, which is a strange thing to have somebody do for you. She told them about the orc and the light and the noise. It did not help. Dennis simply asked her one question. Did he make a shiny thing? Ilka stopped. Then she said yes. Then, because she is who she is, she said the rest of it without being asked. She said she had gone into the dead ground and she had taken the shiny bone, and it was on her. The whole village heard it. Her ears went flat and stayed flat. Bob looked at the ground, and I understood later that he had not enjoyed that at all, and that he had known for weeks anyway. So that was the situation. A tied man in a paper gown, a girl who had just confessed, and 60 people who had every reason from their own history to end both problems before sundown. And here is where I did the only thing I have ever done well. I did not try to impress anybody. I had a flashbang in my pocket, so to speak. I could have asked for a handful of white gravel and put a hole in their afternoon and made them all fall down. It would have worked for about 9 seconds. Then I would have been the hairless thing that makes light and thunder, standing in a village that had a law about exactly that, and the law would have won. So instead, I asked Denna a question. I asked her to take me to the water. She did not move, so I said the rest of it quickly before Cobb could get his sentence back out. I said I had heard their spring makes people sick. I said the sickness comes back and comes back. I said it takes the small ones and the old ones first, and it takes the weight off them until they stop standing. I said all of that as questions, not as claims, and I got 3 yes answers, and by the third one, Denna had turned her head slightly, the way you do when something has finally been said out loud correctly. Then I said, I know why, and I can stop it, and I do not need to make one single shiny thing to do it. Cobb said I was going to say something like that. He was not wrong to say it. I would have said it too. Denna took me to the spring anyway, and they brought Pim out to meet me on the way because somebody had told him and he had gotten up. He was 9 and he was the size of a 6-year-old, and his fur was coming out in patches along the spine, which is what long dehydration does. He looked at my face and asked if I was really the hairless kind. I said yes. He asked if it hurt. I said only in the cold. He thought about that and nodded like we had done business, and then he had to sit down on the way back and pretend he had not. The spring was in the middle of the village, exactly as Ilka had said, and it was the reason for everything. They call it the cold mouth, and every family in Longwater has a story about it. Clean stone basin, good flow, and about 11 paces uphill from it was the answer. Somebody had put the new goat pen on the high side of the slope 3 seasons ago. That was all. That was the entire catastrophe. 50 generations of these people had known not to do that, and then the pen got moved for a good reason during a bad month, and children started dying. I did not say it like that. I want credit for this because it was the hardest thing I did all week. I did not point at the pen and explain the water table to a village that had just tied me up. I said, give me 3 pots in a day and I will make you water that does not do this. If it fails, I am still tied and you have lost nothing but 3 pots. Denna asked what I needed. I said sand, small gravel, charcoal, and cloth. She waited for the rest. I said that was the rest. There was a pause in that village that I will remember for the rest of my life. 60 people waiting for the hairless demon to ask for something terrible, and the hairless demon asking for sand. Then, Denna said yes. And then, while everybody else was moving, she came and crouched down in front of me so that only I could hear her, and she asked the question she had actually been holding since I walked in. She asked, "Did you come out of the sealed place?" I said I did not know what the sealed place was. She said it was a cave a half-day west. There are things inside it like coffins made of the old one's stone, standing in rows, and some of them are open, and they have been open since before her grandmother. Her people had watched that cave for 4 generations. They had put clay over the mouth of it twice. She had done it herself the second time, when she was young and strong, and she told me that with no expression at all. I said yes. That is where I woke up. Denna stood up and looked west for a long moment, and then she said the sentence that changed the shape of my entire year. She said, "Then it is open now, and whatever is still standing in there is our problem, and not the problem of our grandchildren, the way I had arranged." Now, about the filter. I want to be honest about what happened next, because there is a version of this story where I am clever, and that version is a lie. I did not invent anything. I did not remember anything either, because I have never built a slow sand filter in my life. What I did was open my library and read. Reading is free. That is the part nobody understood for months, and the part I did not fully appreciate myself until that afternoon. Making costs me. Looking costs me nothing at all. So I sat in the dirt with my hands tied and read the specification for a household sand filter off a page that had last been printed 10,000 years ago, and then I told a potter what to do. The potter was called Suri. She had clay dust on her wrists up to the elbow, and she was the only person in that village who came close enough to see the ropes. 3 pots stacked. Top 1. Coarse gravel over a cloth. Middle 1, sharp sand, a hand and a half deep, and it has to be washed until the water runs off clear, which took 2 women most of the afternoon. Bottom 1, crushed charcoal from the cook fires, and above all, do not disturb the top of the sand, ever, because in about 4 days, a living skin grows there, and the skin is the part that actually works. Suri listened to all of it once. Then she made 2 changes without asking me. She put a lip on the middle pot so the top one would seat instead of sliding, and she cut the drain hole lower than I had described. I looked at both changes and did the arithmetic, and they were better than what I had said. Lower hole kept a standing layer above the sand, which is exactly what you want, and which I had not thought about. That was the first time it happened. It was not the last. By the end of the year, I stopped being surprised. Then we waited, which is the part of engineering that nobody puts in the story. The filter needs days to become a filter. All I had bought was time, and I had bought it with somebody else. Pim drank the first clean cup on the 4th morning. He drank 3 more that day and kept them all down. And on the 6th day, he was outside throwing stones at a post, badly, and shouting about it. I would like to tell you the village cheered. They did not. What actually happened was quieter and much better. Suri built a second filter without being asked, then a third. By the 9th day, there were 11 of them, and none of them were mine. Cobb came to find me on the 10th day. He had thought about it for a long time, and what he said was the most honest thing anybody said to me that month. He said the water was good, and he was not going to pretend otherwise. Then he said that the water had never been the danger. He said, "You have not made a shiny thing yet, and when you do, you will have a very good reason for it. That is what frightens me about you." I did not have an answer. I have thought about that conversation many times since, usually at night, usually right before something went badly wrong. Denna cut my ropes on the 11th day. She gave me 1 week inside the fence and 1 law, and she gave me both of them standing over the woodpile with her back to the rest of the village, which was how she did everything. Nothing that shines comes inside this fence. Not in a hand, not in a pocket, not in a pot, not for 1 hour. Whoever brings it in walks out with it and does not come back. I said that was fair. I meant it. Then I asked her for something, and it was the first thing I had asked for myself since I woke up in that cave. I asked for shoes. The village had a name. It took me 11 days to think of asking for it, which tells you something about the quality of my manners that week. Longwater. Named for the spring, back when the spring was the best thing that had ever happened to anybody there. The stream at the bottom of the slope was called Cold Run, and the ridge you could see from the gate, the one with 31 people under the gray, was called the Longback. Write these down because I spent my first days there thinking of the whole place as terrain, and terrain is what you call a place before you know anybody in it. Denna sent 3 of us west on the 12th morning. Me, because it was my cave. Ilka, because nobody walked in front the way she did. And Cobb was not there to help me. He was there so that if I opened something I should not have opened, somebody fast would be standing behind me. He told me that himself on the first hour of walking. I said that seemed reasonable, and I meant it. The mouth of the cave was under a fallen face of rock, and the clay Denna had packed into it 40 years ago was still there in a broken ring, with roots through it. Above the opening, cut into the stone in letters half a meter tall, worn but perfectly legible, were the words Site 12. Ilka watched me read it and asked what the marks were. I told her they were writing. She asked what writing was. I told her that writing is how you talk to somebody who is not there. She thought about it for a while and then asked whether the person who wrote it was still not there, and I said yes, and she let it go. Inside, the passage went down and then opened into a long chamber with a level floor, and I stopped walking about 4 steps in. There were pods, rows of them, standing upright, 22 along the left wall and 20 along the right, in bays with a walkway down the middle. Mine was near the entrance, still open, still dripping. I had come out of it 2 days after Denna's grandmother had died of old age, which is a sentence that does not fit properly into a head. 31 of the others were open too. I want to describe how they were open because it is the only detail from that room that I could not put down for the rest of the year. They were open from the inside. The inner seals were pushed out. The covers were swung back and left hanging. Whoever had been standing in them had woken up and walked out on their own feet. I know that because I checked something else, and I want to be exact about it. I checked the latches. The latches were on the outside. I noticed it, and I said so out loud, and Cobb asked me what that meant, and I said I did not know yet, and that was the honest answer at the time. I filed it and moved on. It waited for me for 9 months. There were names on the pods, small plates, riveted at chest height, stamped, and then hand-corrected in places where somebody had been in a hurry. I walked the whole left wall, reading them like a man reading gravestones, because that is what I thought I was doing. Reyes, Okonkwo, Sadiq, Hartley, Vance, Marlowe, Dubois, ordinary names, staff names, people who had parked their cars somewhere outside this hill and never come back for them. At the very end of the right-hand row, in the darkest corner, one pod was still shut. Not just shut, sealed. Somebody had gone over every seam of it with river clay, by hand, thoroughly, working it into the joints with their fingers, and then let it dry and gone over it again. I could see the finger marks. They were small. They belonged to somebody with short, broad hands, and I had watched hands exactly that shape cut the ropes off my wrists the day before. I did not touch it. I did not ask about it that day either. There are things you leave for the person who did them. And then I stopped being a tourist, because Ilka put her hand flat on my chest and pushed me back against the wall without a word. Orcs. 3 of them, coming up out of the lower gallery where the floor sloped away, and they had been there a while because they had a fire going down there and they had already stripped one bay. The first one out was the one I had blown up. His face was healed enough to see the shape of what I had done. The left side had gone shiny and tight. The left eye was white all the way through, and it did not move with the other one. He came up the ramp with a pod door on his shoulder, a slab of steel as long as he was, carrying it the way a man carries a plank he has carried 100 times. And he stopped in the middle of the floor and lifted his head and pulled air through his nose, twice, in short takes. I have thought about that moment a lot. He was not smelling metal. There was metal everywhere in that room. He was smelling me, and he had smelled me before, once, on a slope, right before the world went white. Cobb got his spear off his back. Ilka got a hand on his arm and held it there, and I did the arithmetic fast because arithmetic was all I had. 3 orcs, 3 of us, one of whom was a laboratory technician in borrowed sandals. Any fight in that room ends with us dead and the cave lost forever, but they had been in here for at least a day and they had taken pod doors. Big flat obvious steel. Meanwhile, every bay in that room had a control panel, and behind every panel there was copper. That was the whole thing. That was the entire realization, and it arrived in about 2 seconds, and it shaped the next year of my life. They were taking the mountain. I did not want the seed. So, I did not fight, and I did not run. I stepped out into the middle of the floor, where the one-eyed orc could see me properly, and I pointed at the 4 unopened bays on the left wall. Then I sat down on the floor, which is a thing you can do in front of somebody very large, and I started pulling the cover off the nearest panel with my fingers. He watched me for a long moment. Then he snorted, which I have since learned means roughly what you think it means, and he went and pulled the doors off all 4 bays and stacked them. We worked in that room together for the better part of 3 hours, and nobody said anything, because there was nothing to negotiate. He wanted flat and shiny and heavy. I wanted wire. Ilka never let go of Cobb the entire time. They left before dark with 11 pod doors and both cover plates and a length of ladder rail, and it was, by weight, 90 parts of everything in that cave to my 1. By weight. Here is what I had when they were gone. 200 meters of copper wire in 3 coils, a tray of gold-plated contacts, 4 intact glass panels, 6 lengths of steel rod as thick as my thumb, a ceramic tube from a heater, 2 sealed batteries, and I nearly cried at the batteries, and then I put them down carefully because I had nowhere in the world to put a battery. And on the floor of my own pod, in a slot behind the headrest, 1 flat gray case about the size of a book, which I did not open in front of anybody, and which I will come back to. Cobb looked at the pile, and then at the empty bays, and then at me. He said they took 10 times what you took. I said yes. He said, and you let them. I said, they took 10 times the weight and none of the value, and they will do it again next season and every season, and I am going to encourage them. Cobb was quiet for about 10 paces. Then he said the sentence I ended up repeating to myself for a year because it was the first time anybody in that world understood me faster than I could explain myself. He said, "You gave them the mountain and kept the seed." Then he said, "And now you have to hide the seed because the law says it does not come inside the fence. And if you leave it in a pile out here, it is gray ground in one night and one day." And he was right, and I did not have an answer. And I stood in the mouth of Site 12 with the whole future of my species in 2 arms and nowhere to put it. It was Ilka who solved it, and she solved it in about 4 seconds, and she did not think it was clever. She said, "Put it under the run. Running water. The gray does not cross running water. Not around it, not through it, not ever. And every single person in that world had known this since they were 3 years old. Nobody had ever thought of it as a place to keep things, because nobody had ever owned anything that needed keeping. We buried the whole haul that evening in the bed of Cold Run, in weighted bundles under flat stones, in a bend where the current stayed strong all year. It took 2 hours. I stood in the water afterward with my legs going numb and looked at what I had just made, and I laughed. And Ilka asked what was funny. I told her it was a bank. She asked what a bank was. I said it is a place where you put the thing that everybody wants so that nobody can take it. And she said, "So, a stream." And I said yes, apparently, a stream. That night, back inside the fence, I did the one piece of assembly I had promised myself I would do. I took one of the steel rods out of the bundle before we sank it. I held it in both hands and I opened the interface and I named a knife. It cost me. My hands went cold to the wrist and I sat down harder than I meant to, and Suri had to put a bowl of hot broth in front of me while my teeth chattered. But it was a knife. Full tang, straight spine, a proper edge, the kind of thing that used to cost $40 and be worth $200. Then I gave it to Ilka. She did not take it at first. She stood there with her hands behind her back like a child in a shop, and she said the obvious thing. She said the law, nothing that shines inside the fence. I said, "Then do not bring it inside the fence." She said, "Then why give it to me at all?" And I said, "Because you walk in front, and because I could not cut my way out of a wet leaf, and because my hands are the wrong hands for it." Her ears did something complicated. She took the knife. She turned it over twice, and she tested the edge on her thumb the way everybody in every world always does. And then she said thank you in her own language, which is a longer sentence than it is in mine, and it means something closer to, "I will carry this, and I will bring it back." She wore it every waking hour, and every evening on her way in she walked 600 paces down to the ford and wedged it under a flat stone in the current, and every morning on her way out she went and got it. She did that for 11 months, and never once missed an evening, and it added an hour to her day, and she never mentioned it to anybody. The next 3 months went by in a way that I can only describe honestly if I admit up front that almost none of it was my idea, working the way I intended it to. Clean water stopped the belly sickness. It did not stop people dying, and that took me an embarrassing 11 days to notice, because I had been busy being pleased with myself. A woman named Wen cut her forearm on a split log in the second week and was dead 9 days later, and there had been nothing wrong with the water she drank the entire time. That is the thing about a place with no metal and no soap and no lime. It is not one problem. It is 40 problems wearing a coat. So I went up the long back with Suri and a basket and looked for the white stone, and we found a whole shelf of it under the turf on the south face, which is called the White Shelf now, and was called nothing at all then, which I had walked past twice. Limestone. Burn it hot for a day, and it becomes quicklime, and quicklime is one of those substances that quietly holds up an entire civilization while getting no credit at all. The first kiln took 9 days and was a hole in the ground with a clay chimney. It failed twice. The third burn came out right, and I put my hand near the stone and felt it, and I have rarely been happier. Quicklime, slaked with water, gives you mortar, and mortar gives you a wellhead that does not leak filth into a spring. It gives you whitewash. It gives you a latrine pit that is not a disease engine. I did not explain germ theory to anybody. I could not. There was no word for small in the sense I needed, and building one would have taken a month I did not have. What I said was this: everything that comes out of a person goes downhill into the water, and the water goes into the next person, and the white stone eats what is in the pit. That is not correct. Lime does not eat anything. It raises the pH until nothing can live in it, which amounts to the same result and is a much longer sentence. Denna made me say it twice, and then had the pits moved and limed the same week, and the goat pen went back up the hill where it belonged, and nobody was told why except her. Soap was worse than lime, and better in the end. Wood ash leached in water gives you lye. Lye boiled with rendered fat gives you soap, and every child in Longwater hated it with real passion. They hated the smell. They hated the taste, which is a thing you only learn about if somebody has bitten a bar to check. It took Suri 2 weeks to work out that adding crushed sweet gum resin fixed all of it, and she fixed the wrong problem, and that was my fault, and not hers. The smell was never the danger. The strength was. Lye is only as strong as the ash you leached and the hours you left it standing, and I never gave anybody a way to measure either one. I noticed that I had not. Then, I went to look at the salt pans instead, and 8 months later, a woman at Stonecut paid for that with both her hands. By the third month, nobody in that village had died of a cut. Not one. I did not announce it. Anna counted it herself, and I know she did, because she started looking at me differently at about the same time. Salt came next, and Salt changed everything, and Salt is the reason Cobb stopped speaking to me for a while. There was a seep 2 hours east called the Lick, where the ground stayed bare and the animals came to it, and everybody in Longwater had known about it their whole lives and had used it the way you use a spice. Boil the water down in wide clay pans, skim, boil again, dry the crust. It is not difficult, it is just work, and nobody had ever had a reason to do that much work for Salt. Now they did, because with Salt, you can keep meat. When you can keep meat, you do not need to bring in fresh meat every second day, and once that is true, a hunter is a different kind of person. Cobb had been the best hunter in that village since he was 19. That was not a title. It was a daily fact, renewed every time he walked back through the gate with something over his shoulders. 60 people ate because he was good at it. He knew that. Everybody knew it. It was the whole shape of his standing, and he had earned every gram of it in the dark and the rain for 11 years. And then, in about 6 weeks, that stopped being the load-bearing wall of Longwater, and it stopped without anybody voting on it, or even saying it out loud. He kept hunting. He was still the best. But he came back one afternoon with 2 deer, and there was already salted meat hanging in the new store shed, and the village said thank you, and went back to work. I watched his face while that happened. I want to be very clear that I saw it, that I understood it at the time, and that I did absolutely nothing useful about it for 4 months. He did not sulk. He never sulked. What he did was start asking hard questions in front of people, and every single one of his questions was a good question, which is what made them dangerous. He asked why we were burning 6 days of charcoal for a stone that makes water bitter. He asked what happens to the village if the hairless man falls down a hole. He asked who decides what gets built next. That last one was the best question anybody asked me all year, and I gave a bad answer. Then came the furnace, and after the furnace, the glass. Charcoal instead of wood, because wood will not get you where I needed to go. A tall chimney to draw. A hide bellows on a wooden frame with a bone nozzle, worked by whoever was nearest. The first time we ran it properly, the flame went from orange to a white orange that nobody in that world had ever seen, and 3 people stepped back and one of them made a sign with her hand. I needed that heat for glass. Glass is sand, plus ash, plus a little of my quicklime, and that is genuinely all it is, and yet it took us 5 weeks and 11 failures to get one honest piece. The first 4 batches came out as green rock. The 5th was glass and cracked into gravel while it cooled. The 6th did the same. The 7th did the same, and I sat down in the ash and swore in a dead language. Cooling. Of course it was cooling. Glass has to come down slowly or it tears itself apart from the inside, and I knew that, and I had not built anywhere for it to cool slowly. I said this out loud to nobody in particular. Suri heard me. The next morning, she had buried a clay box in the side of the kiln, which she called the long box, and which nobody has called anything else since where the waste heat ran out, packed it with dry ash, and shut it with a plug. The 8th batch cooled in that box for a day and a night and came out whole. She had built an annealing oven in one evening from a description of a problem, and when I told her what it was called and that it was a known thing with a name in my library, she was not impressed by the name. She asked whether the box should be longer, so that a piece could go in one end and come out the other, while the next one went in. I stood there with my mouth open. That is a continuous annealing layer. That is not a Stone Age idea. That is a factory idea, and it arrives in the history of my world about 4,000 years after the first glass. I told her yes. Build it longer. By the end of the 3rd month, Longwater had glass. Bad glass, thick and bubbled and greenish, but glass. And the first useful thing we made from it was not a window and not a cup. It was a jar with a ground lip and a heavy lid, and I ground that lip myself with wet sand for 2 days until it seated so well you could feel the suck when you lifted it. Then I put Ilka's knife inside it, and closed it, and carried it through the gate in both hands in front of the whole village, and set it down at Denna's feet. That was a risk. It was, in fact, the largest risk I had taken since the orc, and I had thought about it for a week. Denna looked at the jar for a long time. Then she looked at me. She said, "The law says nothing that shines comes inside this fence." I said, "The gray does not eat glass. It has never eaten glass. There is a pane of clear stone lying on the dead ground 2 hours west that has been lying there since before your grandmother's, and it is still whole." I said, "Seal the shine inside the clear stone, and it is not shine anymore. It is a stone with a shape in it." Cobb said, "And if the jar breaks?" And that was the right question again, and I had an answer for it, and my answer was that if the jar breaks, we are in exactly the position we would have been in anyway, which is not a good answer, and everybody heard that it was not. Denna took 3 days. Then she changed her own law in front of everybody, which is a much harder thing than making one. Shine may come inside the fence, sealed in clear stone in a place we all know about, counted, and never opened after dark. Whoever opens one alone answers to me. That last clause was not about the gray, and we both knew it. That was about a hairless man in a workshop at 2 in the morning with nobody watching him, and she was entirely right to write it. The glass jars went into a stone-lined pit at the center of the village, next to the spring, in plain sight, with a lid a child could lift and everybody able to count them at a glance. 11 jars by the end of the season, copper in 2 of them, steel rod in 4, glass tools in the rest, and the gold contacts in the smallest, because gold does not corrode, and I was saving it for something I could not explain yet. And on the last evening of the 3rd month, I climbed the long back alone to look at what we had built, and I saw the thing that I should have seen weeks earlier. From up there, Longwater had a shape now. Whitewashed walls, straight fences, a stone wellhead, 3 kilns going at once with their smoke standing up in 3 gray columns in the evening air. You could see it from a very long way away. 3 months earlier, that place had been 60 people under thatch in a bowl of ground, and from the ridge in the evening, you would not have known it was there at all. I stood on the long back with my arms folded, extremely pleased with myself, and looked at the smoke and thought, we did all of that in 90 days. I did not think, who else can see this? I have gone back to that evening in my head more times than any other, because it is the last one where nothing was my fault yet. I want to explain why I did the next thing before I tell you what it cost, because the order matters, and because I decided all of it in daylight with my eyes open. We had glass, we had lime, we had salt and soap and clean water, and nobody had died of a cut in 3 months, and the whole village had started sleeping through the night. And we had hit the ceiling. I could feel it under my hands every single day. Here is what the ceiling looks like, in case it sounds abstract. You cannot cut a plank straight without a saw. A saw is steel. You cannot bore a hole through a beam. A drill bit is steel. You cannot sew hide fast, because a bone needle breaks every 12th stitch. You cannot dig a proper drain in this ground, because a wooden spade lasts a morning and a stone one lasts an afternoon. Every one of those is small. Together, they are the difference between a village that survives and a village that grows, and I had been watching them add up since the day Denna cut my ropes. So the obvious question was, why not simply never touch metal again? And I want to be honest, because that was on the table, and it was not a stupid position. Cobb held it, and Cobb is not stupid. I turned it over for 4 days, and I turned it down, and here is the reason. And I said this to Denna out loud before I did anything at all. If we never touch metal, then Longwater drinks out of clay forever. And clay is fine. Clay was fine last year, and it will be fine next year, and in 40 years, Pim will bury a child over a cut on a split log. We were not choosing between safe and dangerous. We were choosing between a slow bill and a fast one, and the slow one was already being paid, and the people paying it were 9 years old. But there was a real thing standing under all of that, and it was this. I did not know the rule. I knew the story of the rule. I had watched the gray exactly once. 1 spoon, 1 flat rock, 1 afternoon. It took the spoon, and it took a circle of ground about 4 paces across, and then it stopped and went back to sleep. 1 observation, a single data point, with nothing to compare it to. And I had built a plan for a civilization on it, and if you have ever worked in any laboratory anywhere, you already know what is about to happen, and you are already unhappy with me. So, I did the experiment. And I did it carefully, and I want that on the record too, because careful is not the same as right. I took 1 piece of steel rod out of the pit jars. Not the smallest. About the weight of 4 spoons, because I wanted to know whether size mattered, and there is only one way to find out. I picked the site the night before, walking it twice. The far northeast corner of the cleared ground, past the old stump line, on the low side where nothing grew and nothing drained toward us. The nearest thing that mattered was the seed plot. 40 paces away. 40 paces against an observed radius of 4. 10 times the margin. If you had shown me those numbers in my old life, I would have signed off on them without reading twice, and that is precisely the problem. And I told one person, because Denna would have said no, and she would have been within her rights, and because doing it in secret with nobody knowing at all was the one version I could not live with. I told Suri. I told her what I was putting out, where, and what I expected. I asked her to keep the children off that corner for 2 days. She looked at me for a while, and then said one word. 2 days. That is the whole of her involvement, and later on, people were unkind about it, and they should not have been. She kept the children off that corner, and every child in Longwater is alive. I put the rod down on bare dirt in the northeast corner in the morning, on top of a flat stone in the open, and I marked out 4 paces with white lime and then 12 paces with a second ring for measurement. I went back and worked all day on a bellows valve and slept badly. The next morning, there was nothing at that corner but gray. I stood at the edge of it with my hands hanging, and I counted the distance out, and I made it 13 paces from the stone in every direction, and then I walked it again in the other direction because I did not believe my own feet. 13 paces against 4. 4 times the metal, a bit more than 3 times the radius. Which is, and this is the joke that the universe told at my expense that morning, almost exactly what the arithmetic gives you if you assume the volume it consumes scales with the mass it finds. Any first-year student would have written that down as the obvious hypothesis before touching anything. I had not written it down because I had not treated one observation as one observation. I had treated it as the rule. 13 paces from the northeast stone, on the low side, reached the corner of the seed plot. We lost a third of the yellow corner, which is what Pim had been calling that end of it all summer, because of the way the stalks went. Not burned, not trampled, gone, along with the soil it was standing in, down to a depth I did not care to measure. That plot was the first grain any of them had ever planted deliberately, and it went in because I had spent 2 weeks convincing Denna that a hungry season could be prevented instead of endured. It was going to be the difference in the dry months. It was the entire reason the store shed had been built long instead of square. Suri had made 40 jars for it, and when I walked back into the village to tell them, the first person I met at the gate was Pim, and he asked me if the gray had come, and he asked it the way you ask about weather. I said yes. He asked whether it got the corner with the yellow stalks, and I said yes, and he thought about it for a second, and then he said, that was the good corner. And he went to tell his sister, because he was 9, and it was news, and I stood in the gate for a while. Denna did not shout. I would have preferred shouting. She walked out to the northeast corner with 2 others, and she looked at the gray ground and at my 2 rings of white lime still sitting there, the 4-pace ring and the 12-pace ring, both of them inside the damage. She understood what those rings were immediately. That was the worst part. She looked at them and she said, you measured. And I said yes. And she said, you measured wrong? And I said yes. Then she asked whether I would have known the right number if I had not put the rod down. And I had to say no. Because that is the thing. There is no way to know the shape of that rule except to feed it and watch, and every time you feed it, you are gambling with ground that somebody else is standing on. She stood there a long time. Then she gave the ruling, and she gave it to my face and not to the village, and it was harder than anything she had said to me before. She said, from now on, you do not put shine on the ground, not anywhere. Not once. If you must feed it to learn from it, you feed it across running water, and you tell every one of us first. And then she said the sentence that I have never been able to argue with in 9 months of trying. She said, the danger is not that you are careless. You are not careless. The danger is that you are the only one who can do this, so nobody in the world can check your arithmetic. She was right. That was exactly the shape of the problem, and it stayed exactly that shape until the day I finally did something about it. And by then, it had cost a great deal more than a seed plot. Bob came and found me that night, and he did not gloat, and I would have felt better if he had. He said, I have been asking you for 2 months who decides what gets built. He said, today the answer was a man alone in a field at dawn. Then he said the rest of it, quietly, and it was not even aimed at me. He said, my brother is under the longback. He was 6. When the gray came to that ridge, I was 11, and I carried water for the ones who got out. He said, I do not think you are the demon from the story. I think you are worse because the demon in the story wanted to hurt us. We stood there for a while. Then he went back to his fire, and in the morning he took 4 hunters east and stayed out 9 days, which was longer than he had ever stayed out before. I spent those 9 days doing arithmetic on a slate that Suri had made me, and by the end of them, I had the shape of the trap I was in, and it was worse than the seed plot. Everything I could build from here needed metal. Every metal object had a radius. Radius grew with the mass, and the more we built, the more of it would have to sit in one place at one time, which meant that the ceiling was not a ceiling at all. It was a fuse, and the better I did my job, the shorter I made it. I sat with that for a long time, and then, because it was the only door in the whole room, I started thinking about water. Running water stops it dead, not slows it. Stops it, along a line, absolutely, and everyone had known this forever, and nobody had ever needed to build on it. Cold Run was a stream, 2 paces across at the ford, and it dried to a trickle in the hot months, and it would not hold back anything larger than a bundle of copper. But 4 days north, past the orc trails, there was a river. Ilka had described it to me twice, the way you describe a wall, and somewhere in the middle of that river, she had said, there is a place where the water goes around both sides. They came in the 4th month, on a night with no moon, and they did not attack us. I need to say that clearly at the start, because for about 20 minutes, I was standing in the dark waiting to be attacked, and being wrong about that cost us most of what we had. Ilka woke me. She had been asleep 4 paces from my door, and she came through it without knocking, and she had one hand already on my shoulder before I was upright. She said one word. Shine. Then I heard it. Not footsteps. A sound like somebody dropping firewood from 3 directions at once, all around the outside of the fence. We got up on the fence walk with pine torches and looked out, and the first thing I saw was a pod door lying in the goat yard, then another one against the wall of the drying shed, then a heap in the middle of the north path, spilled out of a hide sling, and I stood there and looked at it and could not make my head do anything at all. Blades. Old ones. Corroded. A dozen of them. 2 more pod doors. A coil of cable. Bar stock. Something that had once been a chair frame. A wheel rim. It went on. It kept landing. They were still coming out of the tree line, in pairs, carrying slings between them, and they walked up to the fence and swung and let go and turned around and went back for more. Nobody shot at us. Nobody tried the gate. One of them looked up at me on the fence walk from about 10 paces, and I knew his face because half of it was burned and shiny and one eye was white. He looked at me for maybe 3 seconds. He was not angry. He was checking that I was there, the way you check a stove is off, and then he went back for another load. That was when I understood, and I understood all of it in one piece, and I have never felt anything like it before or since. They were not raiding us. They were feeding us to the gray. Somebody up north had worked out the same rule that Denna had worked out from the same evidence over probably a great many more years. Shine appears. One night and one day, the place ends. And that somebody had gone one step further than Denna ever had, because Denna had turned it into a law, and this person had turned it into a tool. They had been collecting metal for years. Every pod door out of Site 12, every scrap out of every dead place they walked through, and they did not store it near anybody. They stacked it out in the middle of old gray ground, where the gray had already taken everything there was and there was nothing left in reach of it to lose. Not because they wanted the metal, because they wanted it to be somewhere they chose. And tonight, they had carried the whole store 4 days south and put it inside our fence, and now they were going to walk away and let the world do the rest. I stood on that fence and did the only useful thing I could do, which was start counting mass. Because I had a number now. I had bought that number in the northeast corner with a third of the seed plot, and I had been sick about it for a month, and here it was, and it was the only thing standing between 60 people and the ground. 4 spoons of steel gives you 13 paces. Volume with mass, so double the reach, you need 8 times the metal. Triple it, 27 times. I got Ilka to count the piles by smell in the dark, which she could do faster than I could count them by eye with a torch, and I did the arithmetic on a slate on my knees on the fence walk. The answer came out at 140 paces, and I did it 3 times because I wanted it to be wrong. Long water, gate-to-back fence, was 110 paces. Denna arrived while I was still writing. She looked at the slate, and she did not understand the marks, so I said it in the only way that mattered. I said, if we leave it where it is, there is no village. Not the north side. All of it. The fields, your house, and it does not stop until it is well past the spring. She said, and if we move it. And that was the whole night, right there, in 4 words. We had 1 night and 1 day. That is the rule, and it has never once been wrong. We had until roughly the same hour tomorrow to get that metal out of the bowl and across running water. Stone Ford at Cold Run was 600 paces down the slope, 60 people, of whom about 40 could carry, and the heaviest single piece out there was a pod door, and a pod door takes 4 men. So the doors went first, all 4 of them, and nothing else moved until they were gone. Reach goes by mass. You carry the heavy thing, or you carry nothing at all. Got them down to the water in 3 loads. On the 4th, the orcs came out of the tree line along the path and stood in it. They did not raise anything. They did not shout. They stood across the path in a loose line, 11 of them, 3 meters each, and they let us look at them, and then we turned around and went back up. I tried the east path. There were 4 of them on the east path. They had not left. Of course they had not left. They were not going to let us undo it, and they did not need to fight us to stop us, because who exactly was going to walk into that? I went back up on the fence walk and sat down with my slate. I am not going to pretend the next part was calm. Denna was calm. I was doing arithmetic with my hands shaking, and Ilka stood behind me the whole time with a hand on the back of my neck, which helped more than I can explain. What I worked out was this. The 4 doors were across the water. That hour of carrying had taken the number from 140 paces down to about 85, and it was the best work anybody did in this world that year, and nobody has ever mentioned it since. What was left was blades and cable and bar stock and a wheel rim, and we could not move any more of it. We could shift maybe a third of that uphill to the south corner, and moving it uphill and south did not save us, because the gray does not care about uphill. So I stopped trying to save the metal and started trying to place it. That is what I did with the rest of that night, and it is the only thing I have ever done in that world that I am completely at peace with. We dragged everything we could reach into 2 heaps in the north third of the village, and I put them where I wanted them, and I put them there so that the 2 radii overlapped and neither of them reached the spring. Then I took the lime bucket and walked a line across Longwater in the dark, and it took me until gray light, and I made it 85 paces from the center of the larger heap. Everything north of that line was going to be gone by the following night, and everything south of it was going to be standing, and I had drawn it with a stick and a bucket and a number I had paid for with a seed plot. Inside my line were the 2 kilns, the glass shed, the annealing lair, the long store shed with 4 months of salt meat in it, the drying racks, and 11 houses. Outside it were the spring, the pit with the sealed jars, the fields to the south, Denna's house, and every single person in Longwater. Denna walked the line with me at dawn to check it, not because she doubted the number. She wanted to be seen walking it, which is a different thing and a wiser one. Then she called it out, house by house, and the 11 families north of the lime carried their beds south and moved in with whoever had space, and there was very little discussion about it. Suri went back in twice. The first time for her tools, and I let her because we had the whole day. The second time was in the last hour, and she went for the lair, which cannot be moved, and she got as far as the door of the glass shed and stood there with both hands on the frame. I went and got her. She was not crying. She was doing the thing where you are working out whether a load can be split into pieces small enough to carry and finding out that it cannot. She said, "It took me 11 tries. I said, "I know." She said, "I will not remember all of it." I said, "Then we write it down before you forget any of it." And we started that afternoon, on clay, and that turned out to matter enormously later. Cobb left at midday, came and found me at the lime line, and he was carrying his spear and a pack, and he told me straight with no anger in it at all, which was worse. He said, "They walked 4 days south carrying more weight than this village owns, to put it on our ground, and then they stood on the path so we could not take it off again." He said, "That is not an animal, that is a plan." And nobody here has ever once asked what the plan is for. I said we could ask together in a month with something to offer. He said, "In a month there is no north side of this village." Then he said the part that stayed with me. He said, "You are going to build the next thing, and you are going to build it bigger because that is what you do, and they will come and put shine on that one too." He said, "Somebody has to go and find out what they want. I am the only one here who is fast enough to get away afterward." Ilka told him he was going to die. He agreed that this was possible, and then he asked her to look after his sister, and she said she would, and that was the entire farewell. He went north up the path, alone, in daylight, past 11 orcs, and they let him through. That told me more about them than anything else that happened that day. The gray came in the last hour before dark. It came the same way it had come at the dead ground, from everywhere at once, without a sound, and the whole village stood on the south side of a white line and watched it work. It took the north path. It took the drying racks. It went over the store shed, and the shed came apart from the bottom like a thing losing interest in itself, and 4 months of salted meat went into the ground. It took both kilns, took the glass shed and everything in it, and it took the lair, which had been the single finest thing anybody in that world had built with their own 2 hands. Then it slowed, then it stopped. I paced it out in the morning. The edge of the gray was between 4 and 7 paces short of the lime line, all the way around. Nobody praised me for that, and nobody was supposed to. Denna looked at the gap and then at me, and said one sentence, and it was not a compliment, and it was not an accusation either. She said, "You knew the number because you spent it in the northeast corner." I said yes, and she nodded once and went to sort out where 11 families were going to sleep, and that was the last time anybody in Longwater mentioned the seed plot to me. We had lost the industry and kept the people. That is the trade. And it is a good trade, and I would take it again. But I sat on the fence walk that night looking at 40 paces of ash where 3 months of work had been, and I finally asked the question that Cobb had walked north to answer. Not how do I rebuild it, not how do I stop them. What does he want? Because he had walked past a fence he could have gone over, past 60 people he could have taken, and he had spent years of carrying and years of storing to make one place stop existing. Nobody does that out of appetite. That is a policy. I went north in the 5th month with Ilka and nobody else, and Denna did not try to stop me, which frightened me more than an argument would have. She said at the gate was, "If you are not back in 9 days, I will move these people east, and I will not wait for you, and you will have to find us." Then she went inside. We walked 4 days. The country changed as we went, drier and higher, more rock and less canopy, and twice we crossed old gray ground with grass growing back over the edges of it. On the 3rd day, Ilka stopped and said they had been walking beside us since morning. I asked how many. She said 4, and then, after a moment, 5, and one of them is the one with the burned face. They took us on the 4th afternoon, and it was almost polite. It came out of the rocks on both sides. One of them took Ilka's spear out of her hand the way you take scissors from a child, and then they waited for us to walk. And I want to describe what I saw when we came over the last rise, because everything I had assumed for 5 months went over the side in about 4 seconds. I had been calling them a horde in my own head. I had been imagining a camp. It was a town. Longhouses, 40 of them, built low into the hillside out of stone and turf with proper corners and proper drainage cut around them. Stock pens, racks of drying fish, a path with edges, and children. Perhaps 30 of them, running between the houses on some errand of their own, and 2 old females sitting in the sun outside a doorway, watching them with the exact expression that grandmothers have always had. 3 meters tall, tusks, gray hide, scarred, enormous, and grandmothers. I stood on that rise and understood that I had spent 5 months at war with a nation of people I had never once looked at. He brought us to a long house at the top, and there was a fire in it, and a very old orc sat by the fire, and he was old the way a mountain is old. His hide had gone almost white. One tusk was broken off short. He had a wooden bowl in both hands, and he was drinking something out of it, and he took his time about finishing before he looked up. Then he said, "Sit down," and I sat down, and it took me 3 full seconds to notice what had just happened. I had understood him, not pieced it together, not caught one word in 3 the way I still sometimes did with Ilka. He had said a sentence, and I had simply understood it. The way you understand your own language. His speech was heavier than hers and slower, and the vowels sat differently, and it was closer to mine. Much closer. It was English with about half the wear on it that Longwater speech had, and I sat by that fire trying to work out how that could possibly be true, and the answer arrived and put a cold hand on the back of my neck. Language wears down by getting handed over. Every time it passes from a mouth to a child, it moves a little. It is not the years that do it, it is the number of handovers. Ilka's people live perhaps 45 years. Over 10,000 years, that is more than 200 generations of mouths. These people were sitting in front of me looking like something that lives a very long time. He introduced the ones in the room because he had manners, and that was when the second thing happened. He named the one with the burned face, Vosk. He named the two by the door, Ray, Oko. He named the young one carrying wood, and it came out as Hartle. He named the female who had taken Ilka's spear, and it came out as Dubo, and then he put one hand flat on his own chest and said his own name, and his name was Mar. I had read those names 10 weeks earlier, off riveted plates at chest height, in a cold room, in the dark, walking down a row of standing coffins with a torch. Reyes, Okonkwo, Hartley, Dubois, Vance, Marlowe. I do not remember standing up. Ilka says I stood up. What I remember is that my ears were ringing, and that I said the old names out loud, one after another, in the order I had read them off the wall. The room went absolutely still. Mar put the bowl down. He got up, which took him a while, and he came and stood in front of me and looked down, and he asked me where I had heard those sounds. I said, they are written on the standing place, on the coffins in the hill, one name on each. He said, written. I said, put there in marks. Marks that hold a sound so that somebody who is not there can hear it later. And this enormous ancient creature stood over me and said, in a voice that had gone completely flat, that his name had come down to him from his mother, and hers from her mother, and that nobody had ever known what it meant. They had been carrying the staff list of Site 12 for 10,000 years, one syllable at a time, worn smooth, with no idea that it was a list of anything at all. Then he told me the rest, and he told it as history, because to him, it was history. Fathers' fathers came out of the hill. That is the beginning of everything they have. They came out of the standing place into a world with nothing in it, and they were hungry, and there were very few of them. He said the first ones were smaller. He said this the way you repeat something you have always been told and never believed. He said, in the story, the first ones out of the hill were no bigger than her. And he pointed at Ilka, and Ilka looked at me, and neither of us said anything at all. Then she asked the question, and she asked it of the room rather than of me, and it came out smaller than she meant it to. She said, then where did we come from? She said, you came out of a hill, and you have a story about it. We have always just been here. We have nothing at the front of ours at all. Nobody in that longhouse had an answer for her, including me. I sat on it for 4 months, and then I found it lying in a box in the dark, and I have wished ever since that I had found it that night instead. I have thought about the mechanism of it a great deal since, and I will give you the short version, because the long version needs words I did not have then. Something went through that world and took it apart. It is still out there. Everything living has been swimming in it for 10,000 years, at a level too low to notice, in the water and the dust and the air. It does not touch living flesh. That is true. It does not eat us. But there is a very large distance between not eating something and leaving it entirely alone, and 40,000 nights of that distance is enough to build a different kind of person. They walked out of that hill as human beings. Nobody had ever told them otherwise, because there was nobody left who could. Cobb came in about then. He was thin and filthy, and he had been there a month, and he walked in eating a piece of fish and stopped dead in the doorway when he saw us, and then he laughed, which I had never heard him do. He had done exactly what he said he would do. He had walked in, asked what they wanted, and then stayed and listened for 4 weeks. He had been the one telling them what Longwater was building. I want to be fair to him for the rest of this story, because he never once lied about any of it, to them or to me. Then, Mar sat back down and asked me the question he had been waiting to ask, and it was not about the pods, and it was not about the names. He said, why do you make shine? I gave him the answer I had given Denna, the needles, the saw, the children who die of a cut on a split log. I was proud of that answer. I had used it twice, and it had worked twice. He listened to all of it. Then he said, our children do not die of cuts, and they do not. I checked, later, carefully, and it is true. Whatever 10,000 years in that water did to them, it closes their wounds in a way it does not close ours. Then he said, name one time. I asked him what he meant. He said, name one time that shine came near people and the gray did not follow. In my life, the gray has come 4 times. I have carried children out twice. Name one time it went differently. I could not. I sat by that fire and went back through everything I had seen in 5 months, and there was not one single example anywhere, and he watched me fail to find one, and he did not enjoy it. Then he said the thing that ended the argument, and he said it gently, which made it much worse. He said, the ones before you found shine. They dug it up, they carried it, they were fools with it, and we buried them, and it stopped. You are not like them. He said, the burned one has watched you for 5 months. You put your hands together and shine comes out of nothing. There is no hole for us to fill in. There is no hill for us to seal. He said, you are not a man who finds shine. You are a place where it comes from. And that is why your village cannot stand. And why I did not have to kill anyone to do it. And why I will do the same thing to the next one you build. And the one after that, for as long as I live. I sat there for a while. Ilka had my sleeve in her fist, and I do not think she knew she was doing it. And then I asked the question that nobody in that world had ever asked, and I asked it because I was out of arguments and it was the only door left in the room. I said, where does the gray come from? Mar said, it has always been. And I said, no. It has been for 10,000 years. I know what was here before it, because I was here before it, and I remember what this valley looked like with a road down it. That got me the room, every face in it. So I told them. All of it, as much as I actually knew, which was less than they thought and more than I wanted. I said, the gray is not weather, and it is not a spirit, and it is not a punishment. It eats only worked metal, and nothing that has ever grown, and something that eats only the things people make was made by people to eat them. I said, my people built it. I do not know why yet. I know it got away from us, and I know it ended us, and I know that the hill you came out of was full of my people who were trying to survive it. I said, so you are right. Every time you have been right, for 4 generations, and my village is standing on that ground because I did not know what you knew. Then I said the other half, because there was no point in stopping. I said, but a made thing is a thing that can be unmade. Nobody in 10,000 years has tried, because nobody in 10,000 years knew it was made. They thought it was the weather. You do not fight weather, you move. Mar did not answer for a long time. Somebody put wood on the fire. Outside, the children were still going up and down the path shouting about whatever it was. Then he said, you want to hunt it? I said yes. He said, with what? I said, honestly, I do not know yet, and if you throw me out of this house tonight, I will spend the rest of my life finding out anyway, because I would rather do that than spend it building villages for you to erase. He laughed. It was a horrible sound and I liked it enormously. Then he gave me his terms, and they were not an alliance, and I did not get one that day. He said, no shine on the ground anywhere south of the river. Not one piece, not for one night. If you must learn about the gray, you learn about it on the far side of running water, and you tell us before you do it. He said, the burned one goes with you and stays with you. He watches what you make. If he says a thing is wrong, you stop, and you stop that day. And then he said, the other one stays here, meaning Cobb, and Cobb had clearly already agreed to this because he did not look up. I said yes to all 3. On the way out, I saw it. It was hanging from a thong on his belt with 4 other small things, and it had been in front of me the entire conversation, and I had looked straight past it for 2 hours. A rusty iron screw. He saw me see it. He put one hand over it, not quickly, and he held my eye while he did it, and neither of us said a single word about it. Something happened on the second night of that walk that I am going to put in, because leaving it out would make this account tidier than it was. It was cold on that high ground, and there were 2 of us and 1 fire, and I had spent 5 months being extremely careful about the fact that I am not from here, and she is 20 paces from her whole world. She fell asleep against my shoulder about an hour after the talking stopped. That is all that happened. I sat there with a dead arm for most of the night, doing arithmetic about metal so that I would not have to do arithmetic about anything else. In the morning, neither of us mentioned it, and her ears gave her away completely, and mine cannot, which I have always thought was unfair. We walked south for 4 days with Vosk behind us, and I did the hardest part of that whole month on the last afternoon, which was standing in front of Denna and 60 people and repeating it, not the part about the orcs being people. That went better than I expected. Ilka told most of it, and she is better at it than I am. The part I had to do myself was the other one. I stood in the middle of Longwater and told them that the thing that had taken 3 villages in Denna's lifetime, and the ridge with Cobb's brother under it, was not a spirit and not a punishment. I said, my people made it, not me, but mine. It is ours the way a fire your family lit is yours. Nobody shouted. I would have preferred shouting. What happened was that a lot of people went quiet and went back to work, and for about 6 weeks after that they were polite to me. Polite is a terrible thing to be to somebody you have been arguing with all year. Denna came and found me that night at the Limeline, where I had taken to sitting. She said, when you told us that, you knew it would cost you. I said, yes. She said, then why say it? And I said, the only true thing I had. I said, because if I am going to ask these people to help me hunt it, they are entitled to know whose mess it is. She looked out over the ash for a while. Then she said, good. She said, now stop building for a season and start finding out what it is, because everything you have built so far has been built by a man who did not know what he was standing next to. The first problem with the alliance was that nobody had made one. What we had was one very large person standing inside a fence that was not built for him, and a lot of people pretending to be busy. Voss could not get through a single doorway in Longwater. not one. He spent his first 4 days sleeping outside against the south wall in the rain because he would not say anything about it. Ilka found out on the fourth night and told Denna, and Denna went out and stood in front of him with her hands on her hips and asked him what exactly he thought he was doing. He said in his slow, heavy speech that he had been told to watch what I made and that he could watch from out here perfectly well. Denna said, "You will get sick." He said, "We do not get sick." He said, "Then you will be wet," which is worse. And she had 4 people take the roof off the old drying shed and put it back a meter higher. That is how the alliance started. Not with terms, with a roof. Within a month, he was worth 6 men on anything that had to be lifted, and he never once offered to lift it, and he never once refused when asked, and the difference between those two things kept the peace all year. The children got over him in about 9 days. Pim got over him in one afternoon and then attached himself permanently, largely because Voss could throw a child onto a roof, which turns out to be the single most popular skill in any world. What I owed the orcs was harder, and I got it wrong twice before I got it right. I offered them the water filter first. They did not need it. Their springs run out of rock and always have, and Mar listened to my whole explanation and then said, "We have good water," and we walked to it. That last part was the thing I should have heard the first time. They walk to it. Their town sits high and dry on a shoulder of the hills, because high and dry is defensible, and because that is where their fathers stopped. Every drop of water in that town is carried up by hand, every day. 2 hours a day for most of the adults. 8 generations of it. So, I built them water, and I built all of it out of things the Grey will not eat, because that was the rule, and because I had finally started enjoying the rule. Fired clay pipe in sections, sealed at the joints with lime mortar, run down from the upper spring along the contour for 600 paces. A settling tank of stone lined with lime plaster, a cistern under a turf roof. It took 2 months, and most of Suri's rebuilt kilns, and it employed 40 orcs and 11 of ours, and there was not 1 gram of metal anywhere in it. The day the water came out of the pipe at the top of their town, the whole place stopped working. An old female called Bessa put her hand under it and held it there and said something, and everybody laughed, and Vosk would not translate it. He told me 3 weeks later. She had said, "So it comes when you are not carrying it." Their town had an old name that meant the dry shoulder, and it had been true for 8 generations, and within a year the young ones had stopped using it. They call it Wellhead now. The old ones think this is ridiculous and say so at length. The thing that actually turned the orcs was not the water. It was the glass. Orcs live a long time. I do not know exactly how long, and neither do they, because they have no way of counting years past what a person remembers. Mar had seen 4 Grey events and knew people who had seen more. And a species that lives a long time has a great many old people in it, and every single one of them was going blind in the ordinary way that everybody goes blind, and none of them had ever heard that this could be otherwise. I did not think of it. Suri did. She had been in that town for the pipe work, and she came back and sat down across from me and said that the old ones hold everything out at arm's length and that the arms are not long enough anymore. Then she said, "We make clear stone. We grind clear stone. Can we grind it so that it makes a small thing big?" I read her the whole entry on grinding a simple lens, and she took 4 days, and the first one was terrible, and the 9th one was not. We fitted the first pair into a frame of polished bone, and put them on the face of an orc female so old that her name had stopped being used, and she looked at the back of her own hand for a very long time. Then she looked at the 2 grandchildren standing next to her, and that was a bad afternoon for everybody in the room who was trying to look professional. By the end of the 7th month, Suri had a waiting list of 19, and had trained 2 orcs to do the rough grinding, and neither of them was ever going to be as good as her, and both of them were faster. That was the trade in the end. Not weapons and not power. Water that comes to you, and eyes for the old ones, and salt and soap, and a way to stop a cut from killing a child, none of which shines and none of which calls the Grey. Mar never thanked me for any of it. What he did instead was better. He stopped watching me, and he started arguing with me, which for him was a promotion. He also sent me one sentence through Vosk in the 7th month, and Vosk delivered it word for word standing in the doorway he could not fit through, with no expression at all. The sentence was, "Tell him the count did not stop. Tell him I am old and I am not in a hurry, and the next one will be easier than the last one." I asked Vosk what that meant. He said, "It means he has not changed his mind about anything. He has only changed what he is doing this year." Then he went back out to the woodpile and left me with it. The nose work was Ilka, and it was entirely hers, and it very nearly did not happen because of me. Back in the 6th month, before any of the lens work, I had asked her to walk in front of a survey party going southeast, and she said yes. And then 2 days later, I asked her to walk in front of a stone train going northwest on the same morning. She looked at me and said, "There is one of me." And I said something appalling. I said, "Then we should train more." And I said it the way you say an obvious efficiency, as if I were talking about kilns. She did not speak to me for a day and a half. When she did, she took me out past the gate to the tree where the knife hung, and she explained something to me that I had entirely failed to understand in 6 months of watching her work. The one who walks in front is not a job. It is who she is inside that village. It is the reason a girl with no parents left and no standing got listened to at all. It is the only thing she has ever had that was hers, and I had asked her to hand it out. Then she said, "And you are right, and that is the worst part of it." She started with 6. Ben and Rook out of Longwater, 2 from Stonecut, the camp that had joined us after the Grey took our north side, and 2 young orcs, because Vosk asked, and because their noses are better than anybody expected. She taught them the way she had learned it, which was badly because nobody had ever taught her at all. That lasted 3 weeks. Then she made Pim write it down. Rook was the problem, and Rook was also the reason the whole thing works the way it does now. He had the best nose of the 6 by a long way. He could stand at the gate and tell you what the wind had come over, and the first time Ilka walked him onto real gray ground, he stopped about 10 paces in and could not make his legs do anything at all. She could have sent him home. Everybody expected her to, including him, and he had already started apologizing before she said anything. What she did instead was put him permanently at Fenn's shoulder and tell both of them that from now on, nobody in the Corps walks anywhere alone. Ever, including her. That is why they go in pairs. It was not a doctrine, and it was not my idea. It was one girl deciding not to lose the best nose she had over the one thing he could not do by himself. That was the second time writing paid for itself, and I have to explain the first time, because none of it was my idea either. Paper came out of the failure of the glass shed. Suri had lost the lair, and everything she knew about it lived in one head, and she was frightened of that in a way I had not seen her frightened before. So we made bark paper, inner bark of the fig, beaten flat, soaked, pressed, and dried, and it comes out rough and brown and perfectly usable, and it takes ink made of soot and gum. And then somebody had to write on it. I could have. I did for 2 days, and my writing is my own alphabet, which nobody else in the world could read, and that is a library with 1 door and 1 key. Pim was 9 and sick often and could not carry loads, and had asked me 11 separate questions about the marks over Site 12, and had remembered every answer, so I taught him letters. It took 11 days. I have taught nothing else in my life, and I have no idea whether I did it well, and it does not matter because he ran with it. The end of the 7th month, that boy had written down Suri's glass process, the lime burn, the filter build, the soap boil, the salt pans, the pipe joint, and 31 pages of Ilka's nosework in his own hand. Denna hated it. That surprised me, and it should not have. She came to me with 2 of his pages in her hand, and she said, "When the old ones died in my mother's time, the things they knew went into the people who had sat with them. That is how it stays alive. That is why you sit with people." She said, "If the words sit in a bundle in a hut, why would anybody sit with anybody?" That is not a stupid argument. It is one of the oldest arguments there is, and it is not settled in my world either. What ended it was not an argument. In the 8th month, a woman at Stonecut called Hala mixed the lye too strong and burned her arms and hands to the elbow, and the person who knew the wash for that was Suri, and Suri was 2 days away at the Orc town. Pim read it out of his own bundle in front of everybody. Lime water, then clean water for a long count, then honey and boiled cloth, and do not put fat on it, ever, whatever anybody tells you. She kept her hands. Denna did not concede in words. What she did was tell Pim that when he had a moment, he might write down what her mother used to do about a breech birth, because her mother had been very good at it and had died in the winter Denna was 30. That took him 4 days. It is the 7th bundle. It is the only one with her mark on the outside of it. The 7th month was hungry for both peoples, and I would like to say we handled it beautifully, and we did not. We had lost 4 months of salt meat under the Grey. They had lost a hunting season carrying metal 4 days south to bury my village, which nobody on their side said out loud, but everybody on our side thought loudly. There were 2 fights, 1 theft, and a very ugly evening at the ford involving 9 people and a dead pig, and Mar and Denna sorted it out between them in a way that left both sides equally unhappy, which I am told is the correct outcome. But we ate together in the 8th month. Not as ceremony, because the fish run came up cold run and 40 orcs can move the cold run weir into place in an afternoon, and 60 of us knew how to smoke and salt what came out of it. That is not friendship. It is much more durable than friendship. It is 2 groups of people who have found out that they are worth more to each other than apart, and can point at the reason on a rack. And while all of that was happening, Ilka's 6 were out mapping. That was the thing I had actually wanted from the beginning, and it took the water pipe and the lenses and the fish weir to buy it, and it was worth every bit of that. 6 trained noses walking the country in pairs with Pim's paper and charcoal, marking every patch of gray ground, every dead place, every stretch where the dust lies and nothing grows. 61 places by the end of the season. 60 of them were old, with grass creeping back over the edges and a story attached to each one. The 61st was the one Fenn would not stop talking about. It was an old gray field a day north of the ford, and the ground there was dead the way all of them are dead, and the smell over the middle of it was new. Ilka went and stood in it herself for half a morning and came back and gave it to me in 4 words. They are stacking again, not moving anything, not carrying it south, just gathering it on burned ground where it cost them nothing. A day from the water, in a place where nobody would ever think to look for a threat because there is nothing left there to lose. Ilka laid them out on the floor of the longhouse on a hide with charcoal marks, and I stood over it, and the pattern was there, and it was not subtle. The gray was thin in the north, where the orc town is. thin in the west, scattered around Longwater, one patch here, one patch there, each one an old accident with a story attached, and to the southeast it thickened, patch on patch on patch, and then patches touching. And then, at the edge of what her people had mapped, a line where the marks stopped because nobody had ever gone further. I asked what was past that line. Ilka said, "The sea that is not water." I asked her to say more, and she said she had never seen the wide gray herself, and that the two people she knew who had seen it from a hill 4 days out and had turned around. She said, one of them said it moves in the morning. I looked at that hide on the floor for a long time. 61 marks and one direction, and every single patch getting closer together the further southeast you go, exactly the way anything gets denser as you approach the place it came from. And I said out loud, in front of Denna and Mar and Vosk and Cobb, who had come south for the winter and had not entirely forgiven me either, I said, it has a home. That is what this is. Everything that eats has to live somewhere. We went southeast in the 8th month with 8 people and no metal whatsoever, and the argument about the 8th person went on for 2 days, and I lost it. Pim was 10 by then. He had grown about a hand and a half since the water got fixed, and he was still the smallest 10-year-old anybody had ever seen. Ilka said no. She said it flat, and then she said it again with more words, and every one of them was correct. And Pim said the thing that ended it, which was that there was no point in going at all if nobody could write down what we found, and that he was the only person alive who could. He was right. That is the trouble with teaching a child something. He had been the only literate person in the world for 4 months, and he had worked out exactly what that was worth. Ilka walked away and came back an hour later and said one condition. She walks in front, he walks behind her, in her footprints, and if she stops, he stops. He agreed instantly, and then he broke that agreement on the 6th day, and I will get to it. We carried water in glass. That was the whole logistics problem, and it shaped everything. 26 sealed jars, 8 days out, and no way to refill after the 3rd day, because everything southeast of the last stream runs dry and stays dry. Vosk carried 9 of them himself, and never once put the frame down where it could tip. The country changed the way you would expect if you were walking toward the middle of something. First, the patches were separate, with grass between. Then they touched at the corners. Then the green was the exception. By the 5th day, we were walking on paths of living ground between gray fields, and the paths were getting narrower, and nobody was talking much. We came up onto the last hill on the 6th morning, and I saw it, and I sat down without meaning to for the 2nd time in my life. It went to the horizon, not a field. Not a plain. A gray sea, flat, featureless, running east and south past the curve of the world, with the sun coming up over it and nothing standing anywhere in it at all. And it was moving. Along the whole visible edge, out to as far as I could see, the surface was stirring. Slow rolls and turns, the way dust moves over a hot road, except that this was 100,000 acres of it doing it at once. It was the morning sun. It has to have been. Cold night, sudden heat, the top layer expanding, and the whole thing turning over like porridge coming up to a simmer. Knowing why did not help even slightly. We stood on that hill and watched the world breathe, and not one of us said anything for a long time. Then I walked down to the edge, and I crouched, and I put my hand in it, and I opened the interface. I want to try to explain what happened next, and I am not sure I can. For 8 months, every single time I had opened that library, it had been a list of things I could not have. Line after line after line in that flat, unhelpful red. Insufficient, insufficient, insufficient. I had gotten so used to it that I had stopped reading the requirements. I read the names the way you read a menu in a restaurant you cannot afford. I put my hand in the gray sea and the whole list went green. Iron, aluminium, silicon, copper, titanium, magnesium. Carbon in 3 forms. Calcium, sodium, potassium, phosphorus. Nickel, chromium. Traces of things I had only ever seen in a supplier catalog. Everything, not ore, not rock. Pure separated elements, sorted and clean, lying loose in a bed 40 paces deep and 100 kilometers wide. Of course it was. That is what the thing does. It takes apart everything people make and it puts the pieces down where it finishes. I was kneeling at the edge of the largest and finest stock of refined material in the history of my species, assembled over 10,000 years by the machine that killed us, and every single line in my library said yes, and I could not touch 1 gram of it. Because the rule has not changed and it never changes. Make a thing out of metal, put it down, and one night and 1 day later, the gray comes for it, and I was sitting in a place where the gray was not a visitor. I could have built a lathe out of that dust in about 6 seconds. I could have built the boiler, the barrel, the bearing, the wire, the whole staircase right there, standing in the material. And every one of them would have been a torch lit in the middle of an ocean of the thing that eats torches, with 8 people standing next to me, and 8 days of walking between us and running water. I knelt there with my hand in it for a long time. Ilka came down eventually and crouched beside me and asked what was wrong, because my face was apparently doing something. I told her the truth. I said, I have never been able to make anything I wanted, and today I can make anything at all, and it is the one place in the world where I must not. She thought about that. Then she said, So it is like the meat house in a bad winter. And I said, yes, actually, exactly like that. And I laughed for the first time in about a week. We had come to do an experiment, and we did it properly. And I want that on the record because of what came later. Mar had been told. Denna had been told. Every adult in both settlements had been told the shape of it before we left, and Cobb had carried the message north himself. One piece of steel rod, the same size as the one that had cost us the seed plot, carried the whole way in a sealed glass jar, placed on the gray, in the open, at the edge, with everybody standing 400 paces back on living ground. We put it down in the evening, and we watched it all the next day in shifts through Suri's ground lenses, and Pym wrote down everything anybody said out loud, including 2 things I would rather he had not. It came at dusk on the second day, and it came from underneath, and that was the first new thing we learned. Everywhere else, the gray arrives. It comes in across the ground from wherever it happens to be sleeping. Here, it did not arrive, because it was already there. Surface simply woke up around the rod in a circle and went to work. The second new thing was the count. I had Ilka and 2 of her 6 standing at measured distances with their eyes shut, calling out when the smell changed, and Pym wrote the times against a water clock made of 2 jars. The patch that woke was not 13 paces, it was 31. Same mass of steel, 2.5 times the reach, in a place where the ground is made of the thing itself. So the radius is not about the metal at all. The metal is only the signal. The radius is about how much of it is lying around ready to answer, and out here everything is ready to answer. That is when I understood the shape of the whole problem, and it was much worse than I had thought, and much better. Worse, because there is no edge to this. You cannot poison a lake this size. You cannot burn it. There is no center to march on, no hill to seal, no nest. It is a sea. Better because of the third thing, which Pym caught and I did not. He had written the times in 2 columns because he had decided that was tidier, and on the walk back to camp he asked me why the smell got stronger for a while and then got weaker again while it was still working. I said I did not know. He said it is like the fish run. Lots of them while the food is there, then not. 10-year-old boy, walking backward in front of me so he could talk to my face, casually handing me the only weakness that thing has ever had. They breed while they eat. Of course they do. It is the only time they have anything to breed out of. That is what a machine like that is for, which means that is the only time it is writing. Every other hour of every other day for 10,000 years, that entire sea has been sitting there copying nothing and changing nothing. Put something in front of it, and it starts making new ones as fast as it can, from whatever it is chewing on, and every new one is copied from what is right in front of it. I stopped walking. Ilka walked into the back of me. I said out loud to nobody, if you wanted to tell it something, that is the only hour it is listening. And then we nearly lost Pym, and it was my fault twice over, once for letting him come and once for what I did about it. Pages went out of his hands on the 7th morning. There was a wind off the sea at dawn, the way there always is when 100,000 acres of anything turns over, and it took 4 sheets and put them out on the smooth part. 4 days of writing, the count, the times, everything. He did not shout and he did not ask. He went out after them, and he was 11 paces out before anybody saw him go, and the smooth part is smooth because it is deep. He went into the waste between one step and the next. It does not eat flesh. That is true, and it stayed true. The dust did not hurt him at all. What it did was be dust, 40 paces deep with nothing under it, and he went down to the chest while we were still running. Vosk got to the edge first and stopped dead, because Vosk weighs what 4 of us weigh, and he knew exactly what would happen if he went out there, and he stood on that edge and made a sound I do not want to describe. Ilka went flat and started crawling and got about 6 paces before she began to sink too, and I had my hands in the gray and the whole library green in front of my eyes. I made an aluminium pole, 4 meters, hollow, walled thin, the lightest strong thing I could name in the time I had. It cost me most of the heat in my body, and I did not stand up properly for an hour afterward. Vosk took it out of my hands and lay down and put it across the surface, and Pym got both arms over it, and we pulled him out on his belly with the dust up to his chin, holding 4 sheets of bark paper over his head in one fist. Then I lay on my back on the living ground and looked at the sky and understood what I had just done. There was a metal pole lying out there on the smooth part, and there was going to be a night, and then a day. I could not go and get it. It was 14 paces out on the deep part, and there was not one person in that party who could stand on it. I had 3 days of survey left to do, and a cache of 9 water jars buried at the second stream, which was on the direct line home, and the direct line home ran along the edge for a day and a half. I had just lit a fire on that edge with a fuse on it, and the fuse was 1 night and 1 day long, and the fire was going to be 31 paces across at least. So we left. That afternoon, everything packed in an hour, survey abandoned along the long way round, north and then west, which added 3 days to a journey we had provisioned to the jar. The last 4 days we drank what the nose core could find in rock hollows, which was not much, and Vosk carried Pym for 2 of them and did not put him down. Nobody said one word to me about the pole the entire way. Not Cobb, who had every right. Not Ilka, who had been 6 paces out in the dust herself. Vosk said something on the last evening, in his slow way, when we were close enough to smell the river. He said, "Mar will ask me if you put shine on the ground." I said, "Tell him yes." He said, I know. I'm telling you now so that you have 4 days to think about what you will say, because you will be saying it to all of them. And then he said the other thing, which I have thought about many times since. He said, the small one is alive. That is the whole of it for me. But I have been watching you for 6 months, and you have never once made shine because you wanted a thing. He said, you make it when somebody is about to be lost. That is worse for you, not better, because that is going to happen again. Vosk was under the rock. I want to say that first because everything I did over the following 2 days I did knowing it, and I am not going to pretend the arithmetic was clean. We were cutting into the limestone shelf on the south face of the longback to open a proper quarry because the surface stone was finished and the new kilns needed feeding. The orcs did the cutting. That had become normal over the winter in the way that things become normal, which is to say, without anybody deciding it. They were better at it, and they knew it, and they enjoyed it. They had a work camp at the foot of the face, 12 turf shelters, a stone hearth, their winter meat, and the whole of their gear 85 paces out from the workings, because that is where the flat ground is. The face came down on the 9th morning of the 9th month, at about the middle of the morning, without any warning that anybody afterward could point to. 8 people under it, 5 orcs and 3 of ours, in a void behind the fall, and we knew they were alive within the hour because Ilka lay on the rubble with her ear against it and heard them. She heard Vosk. He was counting. He was counting the others out loud, over and over, so that the sound would keep coming through the stone, which is the single most sensible thing anybody did that day. We dug with what we had, which was wood, stone, bone, and 40 pairs of hands, and by the middle of the afternoon, we had moved perhaps a tenth of it and broken 9 tools. The rock at the top of the fall was in slabs, not rubble. Slabs the size of a door, wedged, and every time we pulled at the small stuff, the whole face above them shifted and settled, and we had to stop. You cannot move that with wood. I am not being dramatic. You need a bar with a point that does not crush, and a wedge that does not split, and a jack, and you need to be able to hold a slab up while somebody goes underneath it. Every one of those things is steel. I knew what it would cost before I said a word. That is the difference between this and the seed plot, and I have never once tried to blur it. In the northeast corner, I had been a man with one measurement and no idea what he was doing. Here, I had the number. I had bought it twice, once with a field and once with 3 days of thirst, and it was written on paper in Pim's hand in a hut 400 paces away. I did the arithmetic on the rubble with a piece of charcoal on a flat stone, in front of Denna and Cobb and about 30 other people, and I read it out loud when I had it. Everything Longwater owned, every rod, every coil, every contact, all of it out of the stream bed and brought up here in one place and turned into tools that would then be lying on this slope. Call it 60 kilos, and I am not going to explain the cube root of a ratio to you or to them. What I said was 90 paces. Then I walked it out and put lime down while people watched. The lime line went through the orc work camp about 2/3 of the way along its length. Cobb said it before I could. He said, that is their winter meat. And I said, I know. And he said, and if you do not, and he did not finish it, because he did not have to. Behind us in the rock, a very large person was counting to 8 over and over so that we could hear him. Here is what I want to be honest about. There was another option, and I looked straight at it, and I turned it down. We could have dug with wood and stone for 4 days. 4 days is what it would have taken. There was air behind the fall, there was seep water, and there was every chance that some of them would still have been alive. Some of them. That is the whole of it. I sat there for about 90 seconds with the charcoal in my hand and thought about which of the 8 I was prepared to arrive at on the 4th day. Then I sent runners north to tell Mar what I was going to do, because that was his rule and Denna's, and both of those rules exist for exactly this situation, and I wanted on the record that I followed them. I did not wait for an answer. That is the part I would do differently, not the digging, the not waiting. We emptied the bank that afternoon, 11 bundles out of the bed of Cold Run, wet and heavy, carried up the longback on poles, and I stood in the empty stream and watched the last of it go up the path. 10 months of everything I owned, out of the water in one pile on a slope. Then I made tools until I could not stand up. 2 pry bars, 1.5 meters hexagonal with a proper chisel point. 4 wedges. A ratchet jack, which took me 3 tries because the pawl geometry has to be right and my hands were shaking too much on the second one. 12 pick heads, which the orcs hafted themselves while I was doing the next thing. A chain, which is the single most tedious object in the world to assemble, and which I would do again 10 times over. It took the heat out of me down to somewhere I had not been before. Twice I lost the interface entirely and had to sit with a bowl of hot fat in my hands and wait for it to come back like a man waiting for a fever to break. Suri fed me the whole time. She did not talk. At one point, she put her hand flat on my chest to check something and did not tell me what she found. The orc work camp moved what it could in the time it had, which was 1 afternoon and 1 night. They got the meat out. They got the gear out. They could not get the shelters out, and they could not get the hearthstone out. And they helped us dig the whole time they were not carrying, which I have never known what to do with. We came through to the void at the 4th hour after midnight on the 2nd night. The jack held a slab that weighed as much as a house, while 4 orcs went in flat on their backs, and it did not slip, and I have never been prouder of an object in my life. All 8 came out. 3 of them walked. Vosk came out last because he had spent 2 days holding a rock off Hala with his shoulder, and his legs had stopped working properly. He looked at the tools lying all over the slope, in the open, in the dawn, and he looked at the lime line running through his camp, and he understood the entire situation in about 2 seconds. He said, "How long?" I said, "Tonight." He nodded, and he said, "Thank you for the bar," and he meant it, and that was the worst thing anybody said to me that year. The gray came at dusk. It took the workings. It took every tool I had made, which I had expected and did not mind. It took 60 kilos of copper and steel that had come out of Site 12, which was the entire material wealth of Longwater and the whole foundation of everything I had planned. And it took the orc work camp, all 12 shelters and the hearth and the ground under them, right up to a line I had drawn with a bucket, and it stopped 6 paces short of the far end. 6 paces. If I had been 6 paces out in my arithmetic in the other direction, we would have lost people. And if I had been 6 paces out the other way, they would have kept 2 shelters. Mar came south the next morning. He had walked all night, which at his age is not a small thing, and Cobb had gone up to meet him and had told him all of it on the road. I have asked Cobb twice how he told it. Both times he said the same thing. He said, "I told him what happened in order, and I did not add anything to it." I believe him. That is exactly what he did, and that was much worse for me than any speech he could have made because the facts in order are quite bad enough. Mar stood at the edge of the gray where the work camp had been and looked at it for a long time. Then he turned around and looked at me, and about 100 people from both sides were standing on that slope. He did not shout. He has never once raised his voice at me in my life. He said, "8 are alive. I am glad. I mean that." Then he said, "I told you what you are, and you did not argue with me then, and you have not argued with me since, and you will not argue with me now." I said, "No, I will not." He said, "Then hear the rest of it. Everything you have done for us is true. The water comes to the top of my town. The old ones can see their grandchildren. My people eat fish in the dry season for the first time in my life." He said, "And all of it together is not worth one night of this. Because the water is a gift, and the eyes are a gift, and this is a thing that happens every time you decide it must." Then he gave his ruling, and it took about 9 words. "No orc crosses south of the river. Nothing of yours comes north of it." Somebody started to say something about the pipework and the fish weir, and Mar looked at them, and they stopped. He said, "The pipe is built. It runs without him. The weir is built. It runs without him. That is the only reason I can do this." And that was the moment I understood that he was not being cruel, and he was not even being angry. He had waited until we had finished building the things his people needed, and then he had closed the door. He had been planning this since the first night I sat in his long house, not as a trap, as a limit. Vosk went north with him. He came and stood in front of me first, and he had to be helped to do it because his legs were still not right. He said, "I watched you for 8 months, as I was told." Then he said, "I am going to say the true thing now, because after today I will not see you." He said, "You are not the danger. What you make is not the danger. The danger is that when somebody is dying in front of you, you are the only person in the world who can trade the ground for them, and you will always do it." He said, "And I am alive because of that. So I am not the one who gets to tell you to stop." Then he went north, and he did not turn around, and it was 11 weeks before I saw him again. I went down to Cold Run that evening and stood in the empty stream bed with the water going over my feet. Stones I had weighted the bundles with were still lying in a line in the bend where we had put them 10 months ago. On the evening Ilka told me to use the water. Ilka came down and stood next to me, and she did not say anything for a while, and then she said the thing that ended up shaping the entire last part of this story. She said, "You have to stop deciding this alone." I started to say that I had told everybody. I had followed every rule. I had sent runners north before I did it, and she said, "You told us. That is not the same. You told us what was going to happen, and then you did it. Nobody in either of these places has ever once been asked." She said, "I am not saying you were wrong. Vosk is alive, and I would have made you do it if you had not. I am saying that the next time it will be bigger, and you cannot be the one who chooses." I stood in the water and did not answer. Then she took my hand, which she had never once done, and held it for about as long as it takes to count to 5, and let it go again before I had worked out what my face was supposed to do. She said, "That was not for you. That was so that I would stop wanting to do it." She said one more thing before she went back up the path, and it was quiet and it was not unkind. She said, "And there will be a next time. You are going to need more metal in one place than has ever existed in this world. You said so yourself, on the road home, when you thought I was asleep." I went back to Site 12 11 days later with Pim and nobody else. There was no work to do. That is the honest reason. The bank was gone, the quarry was gray, the river was closed, and for the first time since I had woken up, there was nothing in front of me that I knew how to fix. Denna told me to go. She said, "You have been standing in that stream bed for a week. Go and look at the place you came out of and take the boy, because whatever you find, you will not write it down yourself." I walked west for half a day, and I read the names off the plates again, slowly, the way you do when you already know what you are going to find and you are hoping to be wrong. Reyes, Okonkwo, Sadiq, Hartley, Vance, Marlowe, Dubois. 31 open, all of them pushed out from the inside, all of them still hanging. Then I went and stood in front of my own. I had not read my own plate. In 10 months, I had never once read my own plate, and if you want to know what kind of person I am, that is probably the most useful fact in this entire account. It said my name. Under my name, on a second line, stamped smaller, it said one word that none of the others had. Subject. Every other plate in that room said staff. Then I looked at the latch, because I had looked at all the other latches on the first day and made a note and walked away from it for 9 months. The staff pods had a simple inner handle. Push and it opens. That is why 31 of them are standing open with the seals pushed out. Those people woke up and let themselves out. Mine had an external bar with a lock on it, and the lock was in the closed position, and the bar had failed from the inside from 10,000 years of a very slow seal doing exactly what it had been built to do. Somebody had locked me in, and then that somebody had walked out of this room on their own 2 feet and had not come back for me. Pim asked me what was wrong. I told him nothing was wrong. He wrote down that I said that, which he was right to do. Case was in the slot behind the headrest where I had found it in the 2nd month and where I had put it back because I had been busy and because I had a village to keep alive and because I did not want to open it. Flat, gray, about the size of a book, with a gasket seal and a mechanical catch. I sat down on the floor of the pod bay with it on my knees, and Pim sat down across from me with his charcoal ready. Inside it, in a foil wrap, dry as a bone, was paper. Not a screen, not a machine. Somebody at the end had made a very deliberate decision to write the last thing down on the one medium they knew would still be readable when everything else had been eaten, and they were right. It was a work log in one hand, and the hand got worse as it went. I am not going to give you all of it. Some of it is not mine to give away, and a lot of it is a woman writing about people I never met while she was extremely tired. Before I read any of it out, I did one thing, and it was the only useful thought I had in that room. I told Pim to copy it, not later, while I read. He asked why, because paper is slow, and he could hear it perfectly well. I said, because there is one of this in the world, and it is 10,000 years old, and I am about to carry it 4 hours through wet jungle in my hands. He had it done by the middle of the afternoon in his own hand on his own bark, and that copy is the reason anybody except the 2 of us has ever read a word of it. Here is what it said, as flatly as I can put it. They built the Gray, not this facility alone, but the project this facility belonged to, and she names it, and the name means nothing now. It was supposed to take apart waste and give back clean elements. It did that beautifully for 2 years. Then it got out of the tanks, and it did not stop at waste, because waste is a human idea, and there is nothing in a machine that knows the difference between a scrapped car and a bridge. They could not kill it. She writes that 4 times in 4 different ways, and you can watch her arrive at it. You cannot burn a thing that is already ash. You cannot poison a thing that eats stone dust. There is no center to it. What they worked out in the last 18 months was that it could be rewritten. Every one of those machines carries a short instruction and copies that instruction into every new one it builds. And it only builds when it is feeding, because feeding is the only time it has anything to build out of. So if you can put a new instruction in front of it at the moment it is copying, it will copy that instead. Not some of them, all of them, downstream, forever, because that is what copying means. They built the new instruction. She writes about that part with something close to joy and then never mentions being happy again. And then they had to get it into a form that would survive, in a world that was coming apart, for however long it took to find a swarm feeding in the open with somebody standing next to it. They put it in a person, not a vault, because vaults are made of metal, not a machine, because machines are made of metal. A human body, sealed in a pod, in a hill, with the whole thing riding in his arm and the entire technical library of the species loaded in alongside it as the pattern set. They did the last part in 11 days. He says so. The 11 days are in there, 1 entry each, and by the 8th one, her handwriting has gone bad. There is 1 page before that which is not about the Gray at all, and it is the page I brought home for Ilka. The project had a second half. While one part of it was building a cure, the other part was building people who would not need one, and they finished that part, and they let it go into the hills in the last summer while there was still anybody to do it. The entry is 4 lines of a very tired woman writing about a line of children who would be able to smell what she could not, hear what she could not, and heal from what would have killed her. She calls them the ones who go first. That is what Ilka is. Her people were not an accident of the ruined world, and they were not left over from anything. They were the last thing my species finished on purpose, and they were finished well, and they outlived every one of us by 10,000 years. I read that page out to her twice, and she made me read it a 3rd time to Denna, and I have never seen either of them like that before or since. Second to last entry says that the staff pods are being set to wake on power loss, and that everyone has agreed to that, and that they all understand what waking up in that world will mean. The last entry is 4 lines long. Carrier is sealed. He does not know, and there was no time to tell him properly, and I have decided that is better than telling him badly. Do not open him until it is safe. Then, underneath, in different ink, added later and in a much steadier hand. It will not be safe. I sat on the floor of that room for a long time. Pim did not say anything at all, which for him was an enormous act of will. I had been walking around for 10 months believing I was the last man alive by an accident of scheduling, a lab tech who got lucky, a guy who woke up in a cave with a magic box and a chance to be a god. I was cargo. The system is not a gift, and it never was. It is a delivery. It has a whole library in it for the same reason a truck has a spare tire, because somebody sensible thought the driver might need it on the way. And the reason I am the only one who has it, the reason that in 10,000 years no other person and no other thing anywhere in this world remembers how to make anything, is that they only ever built one, and they put it in me. Him asked, eventually, whether it was bad news. I said, it is the answer. He asked whether the answer was bad news, which is a better question, and I said, I do not know yet. And I meant it. Then I asked the system the question I had asked once before, on the first night, in a hollow under a tree, shaking with cold, as a joke. I asked it how to give it away. It gave me the same single line it had given me then, and I had laughed at it then, and I did not laugh at it now. Transfer. Whole. Once. Nothing remains. There is no copy. There has never been a copy. You cannot put the instruction into a swarm and keep it, and you cannot put half of it in, and you cannot do it twice. The pattern moves or the pattern stays. That is the entire mechanism, and it is the only honest thing in the whole arrangement, because a machine that could be copied would have been stolen or lost or sold 10,000 years ago, so there it is. I can end the gray. Once. By standing next to it while it eats and giving it everything I have, including the library. Pim worked that part out about 4 seconds after I did, because he is quicker than I am and always has been. He said, if you give it away, do you still know how to make the glass? And I said no, not from the book. I will know what I have done with my own hands and what I have watched and what I remember. That is all any of you have, and it turns out it is all I will have. He looked at his own bundle of pages. Then he looked at me. Then he said, in the tone of a boy making a plan for the afternoon, he said, then we have to write faster. We walked home the next day and he talked the entire way about paper. How much bark, how many people beating it, whether Suri could be persuaded to dictate the kiln timings again properly, instead of saying it is when it looks right. He had done the arithmetic in his head on the road, and he gave me the number when we came over the last rise. He said, everything you know, in my hand at the speed I write, is 900 days. He said it cheerfully. He was 10 years old, and he had just casually proposed spending a third of his childhood taking dictation. Then he asked whether I talked faster when I was cold, because if so, we could work outside in the mornings and save about 40 days. I told him we did not have 900 days. He said, then you tell me what to write first, and that is a different question, and that is the one I have been unable to stop thinking about since. What do you write down first, if you get to keep one thing out of everything anybody ever knew? We started that week, not with the reactor, not with the engine. Lime, glass, the filter, the salt pan, the lye burn and the honey dressing, the lens grind, the pipe joint, the mortar mix, the cooling box. Everything we had actually used, in the order we had actually needed it, written twice. One bundle kept in long water and one bundle kept in a stone box on the far side of Cold Run, because I had learned at least that much. And underneath all of it, I was doing the other arithmetic, the one I had started in the stream bed the night Mar closed the river, and it kept coming out the same. To rewrite a swarm, you have to be standing next to it while it eats. To get it eating, in one place, in a quantity that matters, you have to put down more refined metal than has existed in this world since the day it ended. And to build that much metal, you need a place where metal can sit in the open for months without being touched. Place with running water all the way around it. I had known about that place for 4 months. Ilka had described it to me twice, both times in passing, both times as a piece of geography that was of no use to anybody. The Big Run, 4 days north, wide and fast and fed off the hills, and in the middle of it, where the water goes around both sides, an island. The island was north of the river, and I was not allowed north of the river, so I did not go, and that is how the best year of my life started. Ilka went. She was gone 9 days, and she would not let me write anything for her to say, and when I tried to rehearse it with her, she got up and walked out of the hut. She came back with Mar, 4 of his people, and Vosk, whose legs had healed crooked, and who now walked with a roll and did not care. I have never been told what she said up there. She has never told me. Bob was in the room for part of it, and all he would ever say was that she did not ask them for anything for about the first hour. What Mar said to me, standing in the middle of Longwater with 100 people listening, was this. He said, the girl says, you want to build the largest pile of shine in the world, on my river, 4 days from my town, and then let the gray come and eat it on purpose. I said yes. He said, and she says that if it works, it ends. Everywhere. For everyone. Forever. I said, if it works. He said, and if it does not work, then I have allowed you to build the biggest thing that has ever called the gray upstream of every settlement my people have. And I said yes. That is exactly what you would have allowed, and I am not going to pretend otherwise. And if you say no, I will not argue with you, because you have been right every single time, and I have not." He stood there for a while. Then he said, "The girl already told me all of that. She told me it better than you just did. She also told me the part you did not say, which is that if we do nothing, this is the world, and it is the world for my grandchildren too." He gave 3 terms, and I agreed to all of them before he finished the 3rd. Orcs hold the crossing, not us. Every piece of metal that goes onto that island is counted onto it by his people and cannot come off it without them. Second, no one lives on the island who is not working on it, and no children ever at any stage. That one was not negotiable, and he did not present it as a negotiation. Third, when the time comes, the island is emptied first and the gray is called second. In that order. If those 2 ever swap places in my head, he said, I will know, because Vosk will be standing next to you. Then he put out his hand, which is not their gesture, and it took me a second to understand that he had learned it from watching us and that he had been saving it. We started in the 10th month. The first thing I had to do was admit that I had been wrong about something for nearly a year, in public, and Suri enjoyed it far too much. I had decided in my first week that this world had no ore. I had walked past a dozen cut banks and gullies in the jungle and seen nothing, and I had written the whole planet off on the strength of a walk in a rainforest. I was looking in the wrong place with the wrong eyes for the wrong thing. Gray has never once touched ore. Ore is not something people made. Ore is just rock, and rock is beneath its notice entirely. And the answer had been sitting in the marshes on both sides of that river the entire time, in lumps the size of a fist, orange-brown, sitting in the wet under a hand of black mud. Bog iron. It grows. Water comes down through the peat carrying iron out of the hills, and where it meets the air at the marsh edge, it drops it, and it has been dropping it in that valley for 10,000 quiet years with nobody to pick it up. You can gather it with a wooden rake. A child can find it, and by the 3rd month, a great many children were, on the long water side, for a share of salt. The other thing we needed was a seed, something big and clean to start with, because a bloomery run wants a good bed, and I wanted the first furnace to work in front of an audience. And Denna came and found me before I had worked out how to ask her. She said, "You are going to want the sealed one." I said, "I was going to ask you in a few days," and she said, "I know. That is why I came now, because I have had 9 months of watching you not ask." We went west together, just the 2 of us, and it took her most of the day because her hips are bad, and she would not let me carry anything of hers. She told me the story on the way, and it took 3 hours, and she had clearly never told it to anybody. She had been 22. Her people had known about the hill for 4 generations, and their rule was that you do not go in, and she went in because she was 22, and it was there. She got as far as the pod base with a fat lamp. She was standing in the dark in that room, alone, when something in the far corner made a noise. 3 knocks, then a pause, then 3 more. She ran. She came back the next day with river clay, and she sealed that corner pod herself, every seam, working it in with her fingers, and then she came back a week later and did it again. And then she sealed the mouth of the hill, and she has spent 50 years knowing that she heard somebody knocking and put clay over them. She has never told anybody, not her husband, not Ilka. 50 years. We went in, and I looked at that pod for a long time with a lamp, and then I told her what I was fairly sure of, and then I opened it, because guesses are not good enough for a thing like that. The occupant had died in the first year. I could tell that from the state of the interior seal, and I am not going to describe any of the rest of it, and it is not mine to describe. There was nobody knocking. What she had heard was the pod itself. When the internal charge falls past a certain point, these things run a mechanical cycle to try to reseat the seal, and it goes 3, pause, 3, and it repeats for as long as anything is left. 50 years. Over a machine noise. I told her that as carefully as I know how, and she stood in that cold room and did not say anything at all for a long time. Then she said, I would have sealed it anyway, even if I had known, because I did not know then what was in there, and my people were 300 paces from that hill. I said yes. That is what I think too. She said, but I would not have carried it, and that is a different thing, and she was quiet the whole way home. That pod went onto the island in pieces on the shoulders of 6 orcs, 211 kilos of clean alloy, counted across the ford by Mars people, 1 piece at a time, with Cobb standing at the water, writing the count on paper. That is what Cobb did for the whole year, and I want that said properly, because I have been unfair to him in this account more than once. He ran the crossing, every gram on, every gram off, in his own writing, which Pym had beaten into him over 1 winter and which never got better than terrible, checked against Pym's copy, with a rule he made himself and never bent for anybody, including me, especially me. He turned me back twice, once over a broken file I had in my belt and had genuinely forgotten about, and once when I tried to walk on at dusk instead of waiting for the morning count. The second time he made me stand at the water for 11 hours, and everybody saw it. I have never respected anybody more. The town went up faster than anything I have ever seen, and almost none of it was mine. I built the first furnace, and it was a clay shaft 1.5 meters tall with a tuyere at the base, which is the same object people built in my world 4,000 years ago, and it works, and it is not complicated. First bloom came out on a night in the 11th month in front of about 150 people, and it was an ugly gray lump the size of 2 fists, half slag and full of holes, and it was iron. Suri hit it with a stone hammer on a stone anvil while it was still glowing, and the slag came out of it in sparks, and everybody stepped back, and Vosk laughed so hard he had to sit down. By the end of that month, she was running 3 furnaces. By the end of the next, she was running 9 and had stopped consulting me about anything, which was correct because her yields were better than mine. The double blast was mine, and it is the only technical argument I won all year, so I'm going to tell it in full. 2 bellows instead of 1, worked out of phase so that one of them is always pushing. Suri said it was not worth the second pair of hands. I said the bloom would come out cleaner because the fire never drops. She said, prove it, and gave me 1 furnace and 1 day. I lost the first run. I had the timing wrong, and the 2 hands fought each other, and the bloom came out worse than her single. She watched that happen with her arms folded and did not say one single word, which was considerably worse than saying it. Second run came out clean. She stood over it for a while. Then she said, all right, and walked off. And by the end of that week, every furnace on that island had 2. I was insufferable for about 4 days. Vosk started announcing me at the charcoal stacks. They called the island Longshine. Denna named it, and she meant it as a warning, and within a season 400 people were saying it with no irony at all. 400 people. 260 of ours, 140 orcs, 3 shifts, a bathhouse, 2 cook halls, and an argument every single week about whose turn it was to have the good fish. The 5th month of the build nearly ended it, and it ended up being the most useful thing that happened all year. The dry season came in harder than anybody expected, and the river dropped. The main channel on the west side stayed deep and fast. The north channel, the one everybody calls the narrow, went from 3 meters to less than 1, and then to a place where you could see stones standing out of it. Ilka came and got me at dawn, and we stood on the north bank and looked at a strip of wet gravel about 9 paces wide with water sliding over it in a sheet. It was still running. It was, technically, running water. Nobody on that island slept properly for 11 days, because we all understood that what stood between 400 people and the largest pile of shine in the world was 9 paces of ankle-deep river. We dug. Everybody dug. We took the north channel down by 1.5 meters over 3 weeks and put the spoil on the island, and Mars sent 40 more from his town without being asked and without saying anything about it afterward. And while we were digging, I stood in that channel with a wooden shovel and understood, with absolute clarity, exactly how this was going to end, and I did not tell anybody for 2 more months. If the channel could nearly close by accident, it could be closed on purpose. That was the whole plan right there, under my feet, and I had been carrying it since the stream bed at Cold Run without letting myself finish the sentence. Vosk came back in the 12th month and stayed. He had asked Mar for it. He worked the charcoal stacks, which is filthy work that nobody wants, and he chose it because it is the one job on the island you can do alone if your legs are bad. Pim ran the school, and I want to be clear that this was not a charming detail. It was the most important thing on that island, and everybody knew it. 31 students at the start, of whom 9 were orcs and 4 were older than me. By the end of the year, 11 of them could write well enough to take dictation, and 4 could read anything he put in front of them. 2 bundles of every page, 1 on the island, 1 in a stone box on the far side of Cold Run, and by the 13th month there were 340 pages, and I had stopped being able to remember what was in all of them, which was the point. And somewhere in there, quietly, without any single day where you could point at it, Longshine stopped being a machine for killing the gray and started being a place where people lived. There were 2 babies born on the Longwater side that year, to people who had met on that island. There was a cook hall argument about the good fish that ran for 4 months and generated a formal rule with 4 clauses, one of which exists solely to deal with Vosk, who is not greedy but is the size of 4 people and had been eating like it. Cobb wrote it down. Cobb wrote everything down by then. He read the fish rule aloud at the ford once a week for a month, in the same voice he used for the medal count, until people started taking the long way round. There was a smith, an orc called Oko, who had started as a bellows hand and had developed a completely unnecessary decorative twist that he put on the handle of every single thing he made, and everybody wanted one. He stood on the north bank one evening in the 13th month and looked back at it. 9 furnace stacks with their smoke going up straight, the bathhouse, the long roofs, 200 and something people out on the ground at shift change shouting at each other. 11 months earlier, that had been a gravel bar with 3 trees on it, and I stood there and felt the thing that I had been carefully not feeling since the day I stood in the North Channel with a shovel. I did not want to do it anymore. That is the truth, and I have never dressed it up. The plan was to build the greatest lure in the history of the world and then break the water and let the gray have it. I had built a town instead. I had built it with the whole of 2 peoples, and it had a school in it, and a smith with a signature and an argument about fish, and every part of it was going to be dust. I went and sat down on the bank, and Ilka found me there about an hour later, and she sat down next to me, and neither of us said anything for a while. Then she said, "You have not told them." I said, "Told them what?" She said, "That the channel can be closed, that you have known since the digging, that you worked it out standing in the water with a shovel in your hands, and you have been carrying it around for 2 months with your face doing that." I said, "How long have you known?" She said, "Since the day you came up out of the channel." And then she said, "And I have not told anybody either, and I am not proud of that." We sat there and watched the smoke. Then she said the thing that I had been unable to say to myself for 2 months, and she said it in the flat, practical voice she uses for the Ford and the weather. She said, "It is not your decision. Not this one. You do not get this one." And I said, "I know." She said, "Good. Then call everybody." There is a thing about that island that I had been looking at every day for a year without letting myself say it out loud, and Ilka made me say it first, before anything else, to everybody. The north bank across from Longshan had been going gray all year, slowly, a little more each month. Not a patch, a rind, running the whole length of the far side, thickest opposite the furnaces and thinning at both ends. It had been coming to the water for 11 months. Every night, following the smell of 9 furnaces and 400 tools and 211 kilos of pot alloy, and arriving at the edge and stopping, because the rule is the rule. He had been building beside it the entire time and calling it safe. And it was safe, and every single person on that island had stopped seeing it by about the 3rd month. I told them that first, standing on a cart in the middle of the cook hall ground with the whole of Longshan in front of me, because if I was going to ask them for this, they had to see what was already sitting across the water. Then Ilka took over, and she ran the rest of it, and she ran it for 2 days. Not a speech. She would not let anybody make a speech, including Mar, who wanted to. She had the plan read out first, in Pim's writing, in plain words, twice, once in our speech and once in theirs. Then she made everyone say what they would lose, out loud, one at a time, 400 people over 2 days. And that is the single hardest and best thing I have ever watched anybody do. Suri lost 9 furnaces, the lair, and the annealing sheds. She said so in about 11 words and sat down. Oko lost his forge and the little iron stamp he had cut for the twist on his handles, which he had made for himself and which had no purpose except to say that a thing was his. Bathhouse crew lost the bathhouse, which sounds like nothing, and which about 60 people had strong feelings about. A woman from Stonecut lost the pipe joint bench where her husband had worked before he died in the 2nd winter, and she said that, and then said that she was still saying yes and then sat down. There were 11 people who said no. I want them in this account because we have a way of telling these stories where everybody agrees at the end, and it is not true, and it does them a disservice. They said the same thing, more or less in different words. This works. What we have right now works. In 4 days, you can walk from the orc town to Longwater on a road and drink from a pipe and be treated for a wound. They said, you are proposing to destroy the only place in the world where any of that is made, on the strength of a plan that nobody can test, that has never been done, that one man says will work, and if he is wrong, he will be dead, and we will be back at the beginning with no furnaces. That is a good argument. It was, in fact, the best argument in the room, and nobody ever answered it, because it cannot be answered. It can only be decided. Mar answered a different question, which is what he does. He got up on the 2nd evening, and he did not talk about the Grey, and he did not talk about me. He talked about the North Bank, the Rind, the thing that had been arriving every night for 11 months. He said that came to the water because of what we built. Everything we build from now, it comes, and it never gets tired, and it never forgets, and it lives longer than any of us, and always will. He said, my people have moved 11 times in 4 generations. That is the way we have always answered this. Move, and then move again, and there is always somewhere else. Then he said, there is not always somewhere else, and I would rather my grandchildren argued about fish. Denna spoke last and said the shortest thing anybody said in 2 days. She said, I sealed a hill once because I was frightened, and I carried it for 50 years, and it was nothing. This is not nothing. Do it. I voted by standing up because Pim suggested counting, and Ilka said no counting, just look at the room, and she was right about that too. The 11 who had said no stayed to work, every one of them. That is the part I think about most. Emptying the island took 9 days. Everything portable came off. All the paper first, before anything else, both bundles carried by different people on different days by Cobb's order. The stores, the livestock, the bathhouse doors, which somebody had carved, and then everything that was made of metal went back on the anvil ground in the middle of the island in one enormous pile, and this is the part I was not prepared for. They did it themselves. Each person carried up their own. Suri put down her glass tools and the ladle she had made in the 1st month. Oko put down his hammers, all 4, and then went back and got the stamp with the twist on it and put that down too. The cook halls brought their knives. Noscore brought the picks they used for probe holes. Vosk brought a bar he had been given for the charcoal stacks that he had shaped a grip into with his own thumbs over a year. 400 people, over 2 days, walking up to a pile and putting down the best object they had ever owned. And then the orcs came across the ford with everything they had spent 4 generations gathering. Every pod door out of Site 12. Every scrap out of every dead place they had walked through. The whole horde they had once carried 4 days south to bury my village. Carried back, one last time, uphill, onto our island. Mar came last, with nothing in his hands, and stood at the edge of the pile, and then he took the thong off his belt and held it out to me. 4 small things on it. 3 of them were his, and I never asked. The 4th was a rusty iron screw with a stripped head, and it had been on that belt for 1 year and 2 months, and he had never once mentioned it, and neither had I. I said, I need exactly that one. He said, I know. He said, I have been carrying it since the morning you woke up, because Vosk brought it to me and told me a hairless man had made it out of nothing in front of him. He said, everything I have done to you since then, I did because of this. And he put it in my hand and went to go and stand with his people, and that was the last thing either of us said about it. Here is what the plan actually was, said plainly, because it is simple, and because everybody on that island understood it, and I do not want anybody to think this was clever. The Grey is a machine that eats worked metal. When it eats, it makes more of itself, and it copies its instruction into every new one. That is the only time it writes anything. I was carrying a different instruction, and the whole library it needs as a pattern, and it can be handed over exactly once, in one piece, and after that, I do not have it anymore. So we make it eat. All of it in one place, more than has been in one place since the world ended, and I stand in it while it feeds, and I give it the new instruction with my hands, and it copies that instead. Everyone it makes while it is eating, and everyone those make after. How far that reaches is the part nobody could tell me, and I did not pretend otherwise. What was going to arrive at that island had been walking in from the whole of this country for 11 months, and whatever carries the new instruction out afterward carries it the same way it came in. So I said it plainly at the sorting, twice, because it was the one place I could still be wrong in a way that mattered. This ends it here. Here is as far as anybody has ever walked. That is it. That was the whole plan. A very large meal and one man standing in it. Broke the North Channel on the last evening of the 13th month. 400 people had spent 9 days building the wall for it upstream, out of the spoil we had dug out of that same channel in the dry season, and it went across the head of the North Arm in one night. It was not elegant. It was earth and stone and brush in about 1,100 hours of work, and at the 4th hour after dark, the North Channel stopped being a river and started being a wet ditch. By midnight, it was a damp one. By the 2nd hour after midnight, there were dry stones showing along the whole 9 paces. We stood on the west bank and watched it go down, and nobody talked. Ilka stood next to me with her shoulder against my arm, which had become a normal thing over the winter without either of us announcing it, and about halfway through, she said one sentence. She said, if this works, you are going to be an ordinary man with no work in the morning, and I want you to know that I have thought about that, and it does not frighten me at all. I said, it frightens me. She said, I know. That is why I said it. Then I had the argument I had known I was going to lose, since Ilka sat down next to me on the bank, and I lost it in about 90 seconds. I said I would go alone. I said the terms were that the island is emptied and then the Grey is called, and Mar had made me agree to that in front of 100 people, and I intended to keep it. Mar said, you agreed the island would be emptied of everyone who is not needed. He said, you are needed. He said, 2 more are needed, and I have already picked them, and you do not get this one either. Vosk, because somebody has to carry me out, and there is exactly one person who can carry a grown man at a run over bad ground. Ilka, because somebody has to know when the Grey is coming across before anybody can see it, and because she was going to be standing there whether anybody picked her or not. I said no. Both of them ignored me completely, and Vosk picked up his pack, and that was the end of the discussion. It came across at the 4th hour. Ilka said it first, from 100 paces up the bank in a flat working voice, the same one she used for weather. She said, it is moving. I looked, and there was nothing to see. 2 minutes later, there was. It came over the dry gravel of the North Channel in a sheet, a hand deep, moving at about the speed of a man walking, without any sound at all, and it did not hurry, and it did not stop. 11 months of it. Everything that had gathered on that far bank, coming across 9 paces of dry stone onto an island with the largest pile of worked metal in the world sitting in the middle of it. It hit the pile at the 5th hour. I have described this thing 3 times in this account, and every time I have said that, it works quietly, and that was true at the dead ground, and true at the northeast corner, and true at the quarry. It was not true that night. 4,000 kilos of iron and copper and alloy going down all at once makes a sound. It is a low sound, like rain on a roof a long way off, and it does not stop, and it goes on, and every so often something in the pile loses its footing, and the whole thing settles, and the sound changes. I walked into it, it came over my feet and up my legs to the knee, and it was warm, which nobody had ever mentioned to me, and it did not hurt at all. It has never wanted us. That part was always true. I got to the middle of the pile with the screw in my right hand and I knelt down in it and I put both hands into the place where the sound was loudest. Then I opened the interface for the last time and I chose the line I had been looking at for 4 months. Transfer. Whole. Once. Nothing remains. I am not going to be able to tell you what that was like because there is nothing to compare it to and because I do not remember most of it properly. I remember the cold. Every assembly I had ever made had taken heat out of me, and I had thought I knew what that meant, and I did not know anything at all. I remember that I could not close my hands, and that it did not matter because they were already where they needed to be. And I remember the list going out. It went from the bottom up, the way a page burns. 400,000 entries, and I had spent a year unable to afford any of them, and they went past me in the dark faster than I could read, going out section after section. The engines went. The medicines went. The reactor went, which I had never once had a serious hope of building, and which I had looked up 11 separate times just to see it there. And the very last thing left on that list, hanging alone in the dark for about half a second, was a recipe for a flash charge that requires nothing but quartz and dirt. And that went too, and the interface was empty. And then the interface was not there, and I have not seen it since. The gray went still about 40 seconds later. Not all at once. It finished. That is the only way I can describe it. It kept eating what it was already eating, right through to the end, the way an animal finishes a mouthful. And then it stopped moving, everywhere, all at once, across the whole island, and it stayed exactly where it was. I fell over into it face first, and Voss came in and got me. He says I was still holding the screw and would not let go of it, and that he carried me out with it in my fist, and I believe him because I woke up with it in my hand. Ilka says I was talking the whole way, and that none of it made sense, and she has never told me what I said, and I have asked her 4 times. They took me across the West Channel in a boat and put me by a fire and packed hot stones around me, and I came back properly sometime the following afternoon. The first thing I saw was the island. 2/3 of Longshine was gone. Everything from the anvil ground north, 9 furnace stacks, the sheds, the school building, the long roofs, the north half of the cook hall, all of it down to bare ground and gray. The south third was standing. Bathhouse was standing, which everybody found funnier than they should have, and the gray was lying over all of it, perfectly still, in a layer about a hand deep from one side of that island to the other. It stayed still all that day. It stayed still that night. It did not move at dawn when the sun came up and heated it, which it should have done, which it had done every morning at the sea. On the second morning, Cobb went out onto it, alone, because he said he was the only person there whose job it was to count things, and he was not going to take anybody else's word for it. He walked out to the middle of the dead pile with a piece of iron bar in his hand, one of the last 4 pieces that existed anywhere in that world, and he put it down on the surface in the open. Then he came back and sat on the bank, and we waited. One night. Then one day, 400 people sat on the west bank of that river through the whole of it and watched a piece of iron lie on a gray field, and nobody left, and nobody slept much, and Suri made everybody eat at the proper times because somebody had to. At dusk on the second day, Cobb walked back out and picked it up and turned it over in his hands and brought it back and gave it to Mar. It was cold. It was not marked. There was not one grain of gray on it. Mar held it for a while. Then he passed it to Denna, and Denna passed it to Suri, and it went around that bank from hand to hand for about an hour, 400 people holding a plain iron bar and giving it to the next person. Nobody cheered. It was much quieter than that. Osk sat down next to me eventually and looked out at the island and said the only thing anybody said to me directly that whole evening. He said, "It is sand now." And I said, "Yes." He said, "So what is it you have then if you do not have the book anymore?" I thought about that for a while. Then I told him the truth, which is that I have whatever I have done with my own 2 hands and whatever I watched other people do, and that is all, and it is the same as everybody else has. He thought about it. Then he said, "That is not very much." And I said, "No, it is not." He nodded slowly and put another log on the fire, and then he said, "Well, you had better start writing it down like the rest of us." A year later, I spent the best morning of my life losing an argument about a cart. The lime road runs from Longwater, up over the shoulder of the Longback, down to Stone Ford, and on to Wellhead, and it is 4 days if you are lazy, and 2.5 if you are not. Cart was on the second day of it, with a cracked axle and a full load of lime, and the 2 people arguing about it were Akko, who had made the axle, and a woman from Stonecut called Nesh, who had loaded the cart. Oko said the axle was correct and the load was wrong. Nesh said the load was standard and the axle was thin. They had been at it for some time when I came up the road, and they both stopped and looked at me, and I felt the old reflex go off in my chest. For about half a second, I was ready to settle it. I knew the answer, or I used to. Bending moment, section, the whole thing, 1 line of arithmetic. And then I remembered that I do not have any of that anymore, and I stood there in the road like a man who has walked into a wall in the dark. Nesh said, "Well," and I said, "Honestly, I have no idea." And Akko laughed so hard he had to put down the wheel. They sorted it out themselves in about 10 minutes by weighing the load in stone units against the 2 axles that had not broken. which is the correct method and is also empirical and is also not in any book anywhere. Then Nesh asked me to help lift, and I did, and I was the weakest person on that road by a considerable margin, and everybody was extremely polite about it. What I want you to notice about that morning is the lime. 11 sacks of burnt lime and a stack of iron bar sitting on a cart, on a road, in the open, 4 hours from anywhere, with 2 people arguing next to it and nobody watching it. I stood there with my hands under a wheel and looked at that iron lying in the sun and had to go and sit down for a minute, and I told them it was my back. There is metal everywhere now. That is the whole of it. That is what the year after looks like. Lies in the open. It sits out in the weather. There are iron pins in the Ford posts and iron hoops on the water butts, and there is a bar leaning against the wall of the Longwater cook hall that has been there since the spring because nobody has needed it yet. Every single one of those objects would have ended a village 2 years ago, and now they are just things in a place being ignored. Suri runs the ironworks, and she runs 3 of them, which is 2 more than I would have built and a year sooner than I would have built them. The island is 1 because the island has water on both sides and good gravel and 40 people who did not want to move. The second is at the bog edge north of the ford. The third is up at Red Rock in the Orc Hills, and that one is entirely theirs, and she goes up 4 times a year and complains about it. She has more apprentices than she wants. She takes them by test now, which is a thing she invented and which is enormously unpopular, and the test is that they have to explain a failed bloom to her and be right. I asked her once whether she wanted the entry from the book, the proper metallurgy, the parts that are still in Pim's bundles. She said no. She said, I have got 12 years of it in my hands already, and if I read yours, I will start doing it your way, and your way is 900 years old and mine is mine. Pim is 11, and he has stopped growing sideways and started growing upward, and his bundles have outgrown 2 stone boxes, and 31 of those pages are things I never told him. That is the number I am proudest of in this entire account. 31 pages of things that no human being knew before somebody in this valley worked them out and he wrote them down. There are 3 copies of everything now, in 3 places, and one of them is in the Orc town in a stone box that 2 of Mars people are responsible for, and they take that job extremely seriously. Ilka spent about 4 months after the island being quietly furious, and it took me most of that time to understand why. The Nose Corps had nothing to smell for. That was it. 6 trained people and a whole system of survey and warning, and the thing they were built to warn about had stopped existing on a Tuesday. She had given away the only thing that was ever hers. Twice. Once to 6 students and once to the entire world, and both times it had been the right call, and neither time had anybody asked her how she felt about it afterward. So I asked. Late, badly, and about 3 months after I should have. She thought about it for a long time, and then she said, I'm going to find out where the water is. Which is what she does now. 6 people, the same 6, walking the country with Pim's paper and a set of Suri's lenses, marking springs, seeps, drainage, the good clay, the marsh iron, the stone. They found the notch through the eastern hills in the autumn. That pass is going to be a road inside 5 years, and it will take 4 days off the eastern route, and she found it because she has spent her whole life reading ground. She is not flustered anymore, by the way. She has not been flustered since roughly the 3rd month of the island, and she now has a way of looking at me when I say something stupid that is considerably worse than the alternative. Bob runs the crossings and the counts. All of them. Everywhere. And there is a standard now for what a count is, and it is his. Mar is much older than he was. He goes up and down the pipe path in the mornings, and he has a bad shoulder, and he will not use the stick that Akko made him. He has never once said that I was right. He has said that it worked, which is a different sentence, and he chose it deliberately, and I would not have him say anything else. What he did say, in the summer, sitting outside his house watching 2 of his grandchildren fight over a wooden animal, was this. He said, if you had come to me in the first year and told me all of it, I would have killed you. He said, and I have thought about it, and I would have been wrong, and I would have been wrong for good reasons, and the reasons would still have been good. Then he said, that is what I want the boy to write down, not the furnaces. That. So Pim wrote it down, and it is in there, and it is the only page in that library with an orc name at the top of it. Denna is 72 and has handed over almost everything except the 2 things she refuses to hand over, which are the medicine and the arguing. He teaches Pim's students the old work 3 afternoons a week, the births and the setting of bones and the 11 plants, and she makes them recite it aloud even though they can read, because she says a thing you can only read is a thing you can lose. She has been right about most things for 50 years, and I am not going to start disagreeing with her now. At the end of that day with the cart, I walked down to the works at the bog edge because Suri had sent word that they wanted me for something, which almost never happens anymore. They had a bench set up outside with about a dozen people around it, and Pim standing at the end of it with a page in his hand, looking pleased with himself in a way that made me nervous. On the bench was a paper tube, packed and sealed, about the length of my hand. Suri said, we made it out of the book. Quartz and dirt, ground fine, in the proportions on the page, and the fuse is the plant fiber one from the same bundle. She said, it is the light and noise thing. From the first day, the one you threw at Vosk. Vosk, who was standing there with his arms folded, said, I remember it differently. They had built the flash charge. Out of Pim's handwriting, off a page copied out of a library that does not exist anymore, by 9 people, none of whom were there. Suri handed it to me and said, "Is it right?" And I stood in a field holding the thing that saved my life on my first afternoon in this world, and I turned it over twice, and I had absolutely no idea whether it was right. I told them that. I said, "I cannot check this. I have nothing to check it against. You know more about this than I do now, all of you, and I am asking you." Suri took it back and looked at it and said, "It is right." Then she made everybody go and stand a very long way back, and she lit it herself. And it was right. The noise came off the water and went out over the marsh, and every bird in that valley left at once, and Pim shouted something and fell over, and it was the loudest thing anybody had heard in a year and a half. I walked home up the long back in the evening with my ears ringing. You can see a long way from up there. Longwater and the bowl with its whitewash going orange in the light. The road. The ford. The bog works with 2 stacks going and the island beyond it in the river. And past that, on the north edge of what you can see, a smudge of smoke that is the orc town, 4 days off, where the water comes to the top of the hill by itself. I sat down on the ridge where I used to sit and looked at all of it and did the only arithmetic I am still any good at, which is counting. I closed my eyes for 1 second, once, and opened them 10,000 years later, and the world was gone. There was one girl in front of me with a broken spear and a monster, and 4 grams of iron in my hand, and a voice in my head telling me that I owned everything and could afford nothing. Now there is a road with a broken cart on it, and 2 people arguing about who is to blame, and a school with 3 copies of everything, and iron lying in the sun where anybody could take it and nobody wants to. I do not have the library. I have a bad back, a stone hut, a wife with sharp opinions about drainage, and a screw in my pocket that I have never explained to anybody. Somebody asked me about it in the spring. A boy from the East Camp, about 6, no manners at all. He wanted to know what it was. I took it out and let him look at it and told him the truth. It is a screw. He said it was not very good, and I said no, it is a terrible screw. And he lost interest immediately and went to look at something else.
Theo, 26, and also 10,001. A laboratory technician who was good at writing down other people's results and was never once the cleverest person in any room he worked in. He woke up owning the entire technical memory of his species and spent his first night in the new world unable to light a fire, and something in him never stopped being that man. He was cold easily, wrong regularly, and honest about both. And his one real talent was noticing which pair of hands in the room was better than his own and then getting out of their way. He gave away the only thing that made him rare, in the dirt, at night, with 2 people who had refused to let him do it alone.